Thank you to my patrons. Your generosity and commitment to my work is astonishing. I sincerely appreciate it. If you'd like to see your name in the credits and gain access to a plethora of other perks, bonuses, and extras, please consider becoming a patron today. Simply click the link in the description below. Thank you. So, long story short, morality is objective under the condition that we aren't using philosophy to be deliberately obtuse, and we identify our common goals. And before anybody says, well, what if if a psychopath's goal is to eat as many babies as possible, or whatever, just know that is precisely what I mean about using philosophy to be obtuse. The morality of psychopaths isn't an interesting subject. It's a red herring. So what say you, Kane? Are we being obtuse?
Okay, yeah, there's a lot to say there. I mean, I guess I may end up being a little bit rude in my answer, but I would just say to the question that you kind of did start it. But I'll try to put this as diplomatically as I can.
Take the risk of thinking for yourself. Much more happiness, truth, beauty, and wisdom will come to you that way. Thank you.
Hey everybody, Magic Skeptic here. You're all very welcome to the podcast today. I'm extremely privileged and honored to be joined here today by one Dr. Kane B, himself a doctor of philosophy and a very, very successful YouTuber to boot. As per usual, when I have a guest on, dear listener, you'll be able to find all of those details in the description box below. I couldn't recommend more highly that you check out Kane's YouTube channel. It is an excellent philosophical resource. I myself have learned an immense amount from Kane, and I'm confident that you will as well if you want to brush up on basically anything, because Kane's back catalogue is absolutely enormous. And so, Kane, you are once again, I think this might be your third or fourth time on the podcast here. You were extremely welcome. It's an honor to have you here today.
Well, thank you for inviting me on again. Yeah, I had fun the last time, so yeah, this is good.
My pleasure, Kane. My pleasure. And we're here today, of course, to discuss moral facts, or the lack thereof, as I'm sure you'll argue and as I will argue in this episode. So a couple of weeks back at the time of recording, I put out a community post on my own channel inviting my own subscribers to challenge me with their best questions and so forth about moral realism, because I'm finding, as I said to you in our private correspondence, Kane, I'm finding that there's I can't say what percentage it is. I don't have the data on hand, and I don't even know how I would calculate it. Maybe I could put out a poll or something. I don't know. But there certainly seems to be a percentage of my audience who are moral realists, and they kind of react with shock and horror when I say things like the Holocaust wasn't factually incorrect, or that morality is illusory to one extent or another. It is merely an expression of our attitudes, or it's an expression of opinion, or what have you. And so what I wanted to do is to take all of these challenges and these questions and to collate them and to sit down with you, an expert in this area, a doctor of philosophy, and to run through these challenges and see if we can offer some clarification, and perhaps, I would hope, perhaps convince some people of the truth as you and I see it, which is that there are no moral facts. And to that end, Kane, before we dive into the questions, I thought it might be useful to just start with something of a preamble. We were talking before we went live here, and we were talking about the burden of proof and where it actually resides. Is it the job of the moral realist to prove that moral facts exist, or is it the job of the anti-realist to prove that moral facts don't exist? Perhaps we won't solve that debate here this evening. Perhaps that's deserving of a whole other podcast in and of itself. But could you offer some comments on that before we begin, and just kind of set the stage of what we're going to do here? If you could offer some insight into this question about where the burden of proof resides. What do you think? Is it our job as anti-realists to prove that moral facts don't exist?
Well, I think that I mean, there's if the claim is that moral facts do not exist, I mean, if that's the proposition you're defending, then I would say, okay, you should probably give some sort of reason for that. I mean, there is an alternative position here, which is just to say, well, I don't know, right? I don't know whether there are moral facts or whether there are no moral facts or whatever. I just have no opinion. I think that, arguments about the burden of proof, at least in the context of philosophy, strike me as a little bit odd. I mean, if we're talking about something like, a courtroom where, we sort of just recognize that there's this legal standard that, we have to say, okay, people are innocent until proven guilty, and so, it's the burden of proof is on the prosecution to prove a person's guilt. Yeah, that's one thing, and I think there are like practical reasons why we would have that sort of standard. But when it comes to this sort of debate, like, it doesn't really make any practical difference whether you are a moral realist or a moral anti-realist, or whether you just say you don't know. It's not as though becoming a moral realist or becoming a moral anti-realist has to change the way that you behave, or the attitudes that you have to any particular person or anything like that. So I tend to think that in this sort of conversation, I would just say, well, like, why do you have the beliefs you do? So if somebody is saying that they believe that there are moral facts, then okay, why is that? So I mean, it to me, I think that it doesn't. I just don't see this as like the burden of proof really lying on any particular person here. I would just say, well, if you're putting forward a proposition about the way the world is, then I'm probably going to ask you for reasons for that. And if you can't give me any reasons to agree with you, then like, I'm not going to change my mind, right? So just as a sort of, if your goal is to persuade me to agree with you, then you're going to have to say something in defense of your position. And that applies to me as well. If I want people to agree with me, then I'm going to have to say something in defense of my position. So that's the way I would put it. Maybe everybody has the burden of proof, or maybe nobody has the burden of proof. But I would just say I would like, if we're having a conversation, I would like to hear what people's reasons are for their positions.
Yeah, because what I'm frequently encountering, Kane, and I'm sure you will, you'll have encountered this as well, is that there are people who just assume the truth of their worldview, and they kind of react with incredulity to the idea that anybody would challenge it. So, I've had people say things in my comment section, things like, are you kidding me? You don't think there's moral facts? Are you joking? Right? This kind of very condescending, assumptive talking point, right? I'm sure you've encountered that as well. And that is kind of the worst position here. I mean, that person is not only assuming that the burden of proof is on the anti-realist, but they seem to be assuming that they have no burden at all, that their point of view is almost self-justifying, that their point of view is just so intuitive that we should all just accept it, and anybody who challenges it is a moron. When in actuality, it's quite moronic to just assume that your view is correct and to condescend to others without having put in any of the work to demonstrate that your position is true. Have you had that happen as well, Kane? Do you encounter this?
Yeah, I mean, this is, yeah, right. So I think there's there is a danger though of like, we want to be clear about what position it is we're actually defending, right? So I think that when you say something like there are no moral facts, or let's take the Holocaust, right? You say the Holocaust was not objectively wrong. If somebody isn't sensitive to the sorts of distinctions we might draw when we're doing philosophy, then when you say something like the Holocaust was not objectively wrong, they might well interpret you as saying the Holocaust wasn't wrong. That is, they might well interpret you as saying that you just don't have any kind of negative reaction to the Holocaust, that you do not oppose the Holocaust, right?
That's such a great point.
Yeah, I have somebody I've done a few videos with. He's called Lance Bush, and he calls this normative entanglement, right? So the idea is that people can kind of entangle the meta ethics with the ethics. So when we're talking about ethics, we're just talking about, okay, what do you think is right or wrong? What do you think is good or bad? And in that context, of course, I'm going to say, like, look, the Holocaust was awful. I obviously oppose the Holocaust. I don't want to live in a world where people are being genocided. That's terrible. And I'm expressing, as I see it, I'm expressing my sentiments there. But then we have a question in metaethics, which is a bit more abstract, and we can sort of step outside of these moral debates and ask, what are we actually like doing when we make moral claims? So when I say that the Holocaust was terrible, am I describing an objective fact in the world, or am I expressing my sentiments, or am I doing something else? That's a different question. I can feel very strongly that the Holocaust was terrible without committing myself to the idea that there are objective values in the world, that it's an objective fact that the Holocaust was terrible.
Stands independent moral facts.
Right, exactly, yeah. So I would just, I think that when some people express incredulity, it's maybe because they haven't made that distinction. Now, of course, there are some people who will make that distinction and continue to express incredulity about anti-realism. And I mean, look, ultimately, there's in a very different context, there's a philosopher called David Lewis who has a nice quote where he says, well, look, this isn't an argument, it's an incredulous stare. And I can't say anything against an incredulous stare. I can't give an argument against an incredulous stare. So if that's your response, then I guess that's your response. But I suppose the conversation ends at that point.
I absolutely love everything you just said there. Not to put too fine a point in it, but normative entanglement. Wow, what a beautiful phrase.
Lance Bush says that, not me.
No, that's awesome.
I'm cribbing from him.
That's fantastic. Is Lance a YouTuber or a philosopher, or a writer, or an academic?
He's an academic. But he also has a YouTube channel. And if you're into metaethics, Lance is worth checking out because
I certainly will.
Oh yeah, I mean he's great and he's very fiery, much more so than I am.
So yeah, no, that's so helpful though, because you're probably right. I mean, when I put out my community posts to get questions for this podcast, it could be the case that some of those questions are engaged in exactly what Lance is talking about there, this normative entanglement, where they might have interpreted my comment as something like, I'm not condemning the Holocaust.
Mm-hmm.
But I do condemn it. Just like you said, I strongly condemn it. I think it's a terrible thing. It should never happen. But like you, Kane, I just don't see a reason to suggest that it is factually incorrect. I condemn it in the strongest possible terms in terms of my attitudes towards the Holocaust. But I don't see that as an expression of some kind of moral fact, some kind of stance independent fact that's at play in the world. So this point about normative entanglement is actually something that I'm going to have to be quite cognizant of moving forward, because it's quite possible that I have kind of fanned the flames of normal entanglement without realizing it. Perhaps my statements have been misunderstood as being something like, either I have no emotional reaction to something as terrible as the Holocaust, or worse still, perhaps I approve of it.
Right,
and so that's such a great point. It's something that I hadn't considered, actually. So this is why I enjoy speaking with you, Kane, because I always learn something every time I sit down with you. And I can only hope that the listeners will learn something as well. And so anyway, to that end, what say you? Shall we just dive into the questions then?
Yeah, I'm very happy to do that. Happy to do that, yeah.
Awesome. So I've got my questions open in front of me here. I think it would be helpful. I've sent you a copy as well, if you just have them open in front of you as well, because we might want to refer to specific sentences or specific parts of a question, because
it's a good idea, yeah.
The questions are not, many of them are not short, but you as a fellow philosopher, Kane, will be able to relate to that. Where philosophers are known for many things. Being succinct isn't one of them, I would say.
No, well, yeah, that's no.
So the first question, and I apologize in advance if I butcher any and all of these names, But the first question comes from PP Nevo, Nevo, 7550, who writes, "Well now, Mr. Skeptic, moral facts are, in my submission, always up for debate. What is true for me might not be true for you, or the majority of humans and animals for that matter. Also, what is true today might not be true tomorrow. It is, however, possible and even necessary at times to take a firm stance in these questions. As to the matter of genocide, I submit that it is never warranted, because these lives that are cut short inevitably belong to people that have the potential to enrich the world and the lives of others around them. Killing people simply because they belong to a certain ethnic group, class, race, or religious group, by definition will affect many innocents and is hence, in my opinion, a grave crime. Also, experience shows that it is a tactic that is used for the political gain of a few already wealthy and powerful people to gain more wealth and power. So, I stand in solidarity with the downtrodden, with the victims of genocide and generations of apartheid. I do not consider this to be based on moral facts, but my own moral opinions, and I am willing to take on anyone that dares to disagree with me." So, what do you make of this first question, Kane? Not so much a question
Yeah.
that it is a statement or what have you, but what is your initial reaction? Does anything jump out at you?
I mean, my initial reaction to that is actually this is a great illustration of the thing that we were just talking about, right? That this is a good example of somebody who clearly holds strong moral views, but is not viewing those views as being grounded in objective moral facts. Like they say, I don't consider this to be based on moral facts, but my own moral opinions, right? We can have these very strong sentiments without thinking, that those sentiments are somehow like matching something out there in the world, right? And so I pretty much would just agree with this. I mean, I also am very strongly opposed to genocide. I think genocide is terrible. And yeah, for me, that's a result of the sort of values and attitudes that I have. I think that one point I would make actually is that the kind of thing that you read here, right? Like this really sort of strong emotional reaction to something like genocide. Isn't that sort of what you would want? I mean, there's nothing wrong with being a moral realist, right? I mean, maybe it's an incorrect position, but I'm not going to judge someone for being a moral realist. But I have always thought, if your opposition to genocide is based on the fact that you've kind of sat down and you've done some reasoning and you've come to the conclusion that there's some sort of judgment being made by the world itself that genocide is wrong, and you're like, oh yes, I agree with so that's the objective moral fact out there, right, in the world, and I'm going to have to agree with that. That to me is a bit weird. Whereas somebody who just says, look, I'm looking at this I don't know, this video of victims of the Holocaust, and this is horrifying. Like, I feel it. I feel this fire in my chest, this anger and disgust and sympathy. To me, that seems like almost a more admirable reaction.
Yeah,
yeah.
I agree. It's a point I've made in one of my very own videos. What is moral realism actually adding here? So I use this kind of a silly hypothetical. Imagine a prisoner, a multiple murderer, sitting there in their prison cell reading a meta-ethical textbook. And then they just have this epiphany and they're like, oh my God, it turns out that everything I did was factually wrong. And now that I've realized that it was factually incorrect, I finally realized the error in my ways. It is moral realism that has helped me find the truth. And I just find that to be utterly laughable. This idea that I don't see what moral realism is adding here. I just don't understand why they think that this is an ace up their sleeves, because like you said, how bizarre would it be if somebody, imagine I tabled a particular behavior, say, I don't know, would just to, have a break away from the genocide topic. Let's say, I don't know, stealing from the poor in such abundance that those poor people live lives of misery, right? So if my instantaneous reaction to that, the attitude that I feel brimming up inside of me when I think of somebody doing that to the poor, is one of utter revulsion. I think, what a disgusting person you would be if you were to behave that way in relation to the poor. Imagine the moral realist saying, hang on a minute, I need to go and run that through the hedonic calculus. Or it just seems utterly bizarre, doesn't it?
Right, yeah.
It's
And it
almost an
seems like,
inhumane reaction.
I think that, if you think about how you would, how is it that people come to care about like other groups of people? So maybe, someone is, let's say, very rich and they just don't care about the poor. I mean, my guess would be that if you were to put them in a situation where they were like living with poor people, and they actually started to sort of interact with them and develop emotional connections to them, that's the sort of thing that I can imagine might change their attitudes. But sort of sitting down and reasoning about what the objective facts are supposed to be, it's hard to imagine that having much influence.
Armchair philosophizing.
Yeah,
yes.
It's. I guess I shouldn't complain too much about armchair philosophizing, should
I? At risk of shooting yourself in the foot. This kind of links, just before we move on to the next question, it links to another very important topic here, which is, what methods are open to the anti-realist to convince somebody? Because moral realists, in my experience, tend to assume that if there's no fact of the matter, morally speaking, then there's nothing that one can do, that all bets are off, that we just have to accept genocide because there's no fact of the matter. Therefore, what they're doing isn't factually wrong, and your resistance to it isn't a fact either. And so there's no fact, and so it's a wash and tough. We just all have to go home and accept that genocide is happening. But that's not actually the case at all. As you've pointed out in this podcast in the past, there are in fact a great number of activists throughout history who were themselves anti-realists. And furthermore, there are methods that are open to the anti-realist that they can use in order to convince somebody that their behavior is not optimal in the absence of moral facts. So, for example, just one example comes to mind. They could appeal to shared values, right? So they could point out, for example, hey, look, you're genociding these people. That mother that you just sent into the gas chamber, and her child in her arms, you have a mother as well, don't you? Yes. You love her, don't you? Yes. Would you like if she was sent in there? No, I wouldn't. So why would you do it to that mother and her child then? Like, that might not be successful either, but no more successful than reminding the genocider that their behavior is factually incorrect is going to be successful, right? We're all in this position where it's difficult to change people's minds, and to pretend that the moral anti-realist has no options here, I think, is just grossly ignorant at best, but worse still, dishonest at worst, right? I mean,
I mean, I agree with that. I think that there are many arguments and persuasive tools available to moral anti-realists. As you say, you can appeal to things like shared values. You can try to do things like identify an inconsistency or contradiction in the views of the person you're talking to. So, I mean, this is how a lot of arguments proceed, right? Like, I can try to show, if I'm talking to somebody who, what's a good simple example? Well, I mean, a simple example would be, something like, in the context of debates about animal rights, people might say, well, look, if you think it's okay to kill and eat animals, but this animal has sort of greater cognitive capacities than, say, a 1-month-old human infant, but you don't think it's okay to kill a 1-month-old human infant. So, either you need to identify some relevant difference, or it looks like you kind of have an inconsistency in your views. So it doesn't, it doesn't have to be any shared value there. I can just sort of point out that there's a tension in the moral views that somebody has, and then that might prompt them to change as well. You don't have to be a realist to do that.
Exactly. That's fantastic, because there's no moral fact at play there. You're just examining their worldview and the tensions that may in fact exist within it, which could encourage or be the moment of inception which leads to a change in mind, perhaps not instantly, but maybe down the line or what have you. And that's such a great example. I love it. So yeah, let's pretend, dear listener, the moral realist has numerous methods that they can use in order to convince somebody that they're doing something quote unquote wrong, although wrong there would be deployed differently to how a moral realist would deploy it. But anything else to add there, Kane, before we move on to the next question?
I don't think so. I think that's all I wanted to say to that one. Yeah.
Fantastic. All right, let's move on to question 2. Question 2 comes from Tempestive 1, I believe. Again, I apologize if I'm butchering these names. And I quote, "If there are no more humans left alive, is murder wrong? Keep in mind we can observe moral behavior in other animal species, such as rats or corvids. That which is moral is a complex and dynamic social construct. But as long as we agree on a common goal, we can define framework, work together to reach it, and improve on it as we learn." Let me just jump in here right away and say that I agree with the second part there fully and totally. I mean, that's just basically the hypothetical imperative. Yes, if we have a goal, there will be better or worse ways to achieve that goal. Of course, as an anti-realist, I would just be quick to remind the viewers that the goal does appear to be ultimately subjective to one extent or another. I don't see good reason to believe that any particular goal can be a moral fact, as it were. But yeah, if we agree on a goal, if only subjectively, then yeah, there are better or worse ways of achieving that goal. But what say you about the first part, Kane? This idea of if you're the only human left alive, or rather, it says if there are no humans left alive, is murder wrong? What's your answer to that?
Yeah, so the way I tend to look at this is that I have sentiments about things, right? So one of the sentiments I have is the negative attitude towards people killing each other, and I think that that's a sentiment which doesn't just extend to the actual world as it is right now. I mean, I can imagine a future in which humanity goes extinct, but like I don't know, maybe there's aliens on other planets, and then I might well say, well, in that you can ask me, like, how do I feel about the behavior of the aliens on those other planets in that scenario? And then I would just say, yeah, I mean, I would feel like negative towards those aliens killing each other. So I think that obviously the sentiments that we have are things that have been inculcated by, largely whatever sort of society we happen to live in. I mean, it's going to be like a combination of our, biological heritage and the sort of cultural norms that we've grown up in, right? That's why I have the sentiments I do.
Evolutionary psychology and so forth.
It's going to be some combination of that. So, I am a product of this world, this society, but the sentiments I have extend beyond that. And I think that this is something that we're all familiar with when it comes to like engaging with fictions. So you can watch a science fiction movie where there are no human characters whatsoever, but you might still identify with the characters in the movie, and you might still feel that one character is doing something that you really disapprove of, and so I mean, when you say like, well, if there are no more humans left alive, is murder wrong? I would say, if it's me right now imagining that scenario, then I might say yes. But obviously, if you do just get rid of like all of the beings that are capable of having sentiments, and they're capable of like thinking about what sorts of rules they want other beings to follow, then I would say in that case you basically do just get rid of morality. Like I do ultimately think that morality is something that we do. It's something we construct. And so if we go, then yeah, there is strictly speaking no morality either.
The questioner is careful to point out, however, that certain animal species do exhibit, for example, a fairness ethic. So in that hypothetical where there are no more humans, but animals that exhibit, say, I don't know, monkeys, for example, appear to exhibit certain ethical tendencies. They appear to have a fairness ethic. For example, if one takes more food than the others, that monkey will be reprimanded and so on. Would you, as an anti-realist, say that morality exists insofar as an expression of attitudes in the animal kingdom, absent humanity's existence?
I think this is a really, really tricky question because
Indeed.
the interpretation of animal behavior is a really tricky question. So what I would say is it does seem pretty obvious to me that animals have sentiments. They feel ways about things, and you might well say that some of those sentiments are sort of proto-moral. I think when it comes to monkeys, that it does seem like they display behaviors that are designed so as to enforce certain, I guess you could maybe you could interpret it as saying they're designed to enforce certain fairness norms. Like they will punish other monkeys if they fail to share the banana or something like that. But that's an interpretation which is very much open to question. And so I think the difficulty with this is just it's not obvious to me that we should describe what they're doing as moral behavior.
Yes.
But I'd be happy to call it a kind of it's a sentiment. It's perhaps proto-moral. I suspect that human morality is something that was kind of built out of these sorts of more basic evaluative tendencies. So when you look at monkeys, again, they clearly feel ways about things, right? Monkeys clearly have strong emotional connections, and they will act on them and so on. And then but morality, to me, and maybe this is just a matter of how I'm choosing to use the word, to me morality involves more kind of thinking through rules for governing societies, and it's about by actually kind of having a sort of concept of other people's behavior and the sort of rules you want other people to follow. And it's not really obvious to me that other animals can do that. But it's just a matter of whether you want to call it moral or not, I think, and that's maybe just a matter of
semantics.
Yeah.
There could be just a semantic difference there. Now, that's fair enough. Yeah, and I don't want us to get distracted and go down the rabbit hole, as it were, about vis-a-vis debates about animal cognizance and what they're aware of and what their capacities are. An interesting question nonetheless, and I hope Tempestive has been entertained by that response. A very, very interesting question. Question 3 then comes from Semper Suffragium 9951. For one to claim there are no moral facts, one must first demonstrate that there are facts, and that is no easy thing. The brain in a jar theory is by definition unfalsifiable. Same goes for the living in a simulation theory. Nonetheless, we assume there are facts, even if no one fact can be agreed upon beyond unreasonable doubt. So it would be unreasonable to question the existence of moral facts. Furthermore, any denial of moral facts seems to me to be entirely based on the assumption that we are able to act in clearly immoral ways. Well, just like moral laws, laws of nature can also be broken, and objects can defy gravity, but it will require an equal and opposite reaction in the form of burning jet fuel or something. Similarly, when a law of morality is broken, an equal and opposite reaction accompanies it. It may not always be possible to immediately discern what that might be, but if 3 years studying law have taught me anything, it's that every moral transgression has a backlash coming, sometimes in ways one could never imagine. What do you think, Kane?
Okay, there's a lot to talk about here.
I agree.
So, yeah, okay, I guess, I mean, this is, all right, let me start with, I suppose, one of the final points that was made there, which is the claim that laws of nature can be broken. I think that the so the standard sort of view on this would be that, well, the case of something like launching a rocket into orbit is not that doesn't involve breaking the laws of nature. The rocket isn't defying gravity.
Agreed.
It's just that the laws of physics do in fact, under certain circumstances, permit objects to reach escape velocity. It's just it requires a lot of force. In fact, I would have thought that like, how was it that we were able to design and build rockets that can reach escape velocity? I mean, it looks like we used the laws of physics to do that.
Exactly.
At least that would be I guess a sort of standard view. I mean, look, there's different accounts of the laws of nature, so I'm not insisting that that's the only view, but I would have thought that that's the standard view there. So I'm a little bit, yeah, I don't know if I would get on board with this idea that that laws of nature can be broken. So that's the point about that. Now, with this more general thing about how, well, for one to claim there are no moral facts, one must first demonstrate that there are facts. So I think that when I'm talking about metaethics, I usually just kind of take for granted a sort of, let's say, common sense view of the world where, there are other people and there are, objects and actions and behaviors. Now, I actually think that can indeed all be called into question. I am very sympathetic to skeptical arguments. And if if you want to get into like more radical skeptical arguments, my actual view here is I don't think anyone has ever given me a good reason to believe that that there actually is even an external world. Now, for practical purposes, I kind of just assume that there is, and I mean, I might kind of go along with it. But the honest truth is, I don't think there's actually a good argument which establishes the existence even of an external world.
The questioner kind of hints at that.
Yeah.
When they
with
point out
the brain in the jar theory and the simulation theory. I should,
indeed.
just to do a little plug here, I should say what my most recent video was on the simulation hypothesis. So, if people are interested in the simulation hypothesis, then maybe they should check that out. But anyway, when it comes to metaethics, one thing to bear in mind is that moral laws are, so the usual way that we would think about this is that what's right or wrong morally is not it's going to be dependent on the facts, but like the general moral principles are going to hold regardless of the way the world is. So let's say, for instance, you're a utilitarian and you think that the right action is whatever maximizes happiness. Well, you can endorse that view like regardless of whether or not there are even any other people. I mean, maybe nobody actually exists, but then you would just frame it in a conditional. You just put it as a conditional. You'd say, well, if there were other people, then you ought to maximize happiness or something like that.
Because the moral fact exists independent of the fact of humans being alive.
Yeah.
Because moral realists think that there are stance independent moral facts that exist. Just like one rock plus another rock would equal two rocks, even if human beings didn't exist, so too do the moral facts exist, even if we didn't exist.
Yes, and notice as well that one rock plus another rock would equal two rocks, even if no rocks existed. Because
indeed,
what you have there is that, I mean, it's a claim about mathematics, right? So it would be like, well, if you had this rock and you had another rock, then you would have two rocks.
Well, it's basically just you can do it in the abstract. X plus X equals 2X, right? I mean, you can just do it. Something plus something equals two of that something. So yeah, quite right. You can do this with right. I'm just going to invent a fictitious object. Fictitious object is going to be called a geschmoogelboogel, right? A geschmoogelboogel plus a geschmoogelboogel equals two geschmoogelmoogles, right? So it just, I mean, I agree. That's a very long way of explaining why I agree. But yes, I agree.
So I think that it doesn't really matter whether we are external world skeptics or not, actually, for the purposes of talking about moral facts. That would be my take on this, right? But I mean, ultimately, I guess the sort of line that's being pushed here is, well, if you're claiming that there are no moral facts, then it looks like similarly you're going to be perhaps pushed to a kind of skepticism in these other contexts as well. And the truth is that I'm actually quite happy to just embrace skepticism in those other contexts. And when I say skepticism here, I mean I'm happy to just grant that I actually don't know that there's an external world. Now, but I would say even if you don't get on board with all of that stuff, when it comes to debates in metaethics, we can just sort of ask the question of, well, if there were human beings, right, would it be objectively wrong to, commit genocide or something? We can frame it in that way. So I think that answers the question. I'm not sure. Does that seem like a good answer to that question?
No, it sounds like a great answer. Allow me to offer my 2 cents. I'd be very curious to get your response to my thinking on this. As a person whose YouTube channel generally focuses on the arguments for God's existence, I can't help when reading this question but be reminded of the kind of talking points that apologists engage in when they're trying to, demonstrate the existence of the divine or what have you. So what they will often do is try and flip the script and put the pressure on the atheist so that they don't have to do the proving of their own position, right? And that's kind of what's happening here, right? So apologists will say things like, I don't know, you can't even prove that the external world is real, so you have faith too. When you get out of bed in the morning, you're demonstrating that you have faith. You're demonstrating that you believe the external world is real, and you believe that without evidence, so therefore I'm entitled to believe in God without evidence, right? That kind of argument. Now, that's a terrible argument. So first of all, whether the world is real or not is irrelevant, because I'm stuck here hopelessly. Whether it's a simulation or not, I'm here. And so I'm going to act in this world, whether it's a simulation or whether it's real or whatever it is. The difference, however, is that you and I can have a conversation, and maybe you're a figment of my imagination, but when we have that conversation, we can both agree that this is a thermos, and we can both agree that drinking water is necessary for existence or your continued existence and so on. So this simulation, if it is a simulation, appears to be acting according to certain rules and norms. And the fact that I get out of bed in the morning doesn't actually confirm that I believe that the simulation isn't a simulation. Like you, Kane, I'm just happy to say that actually, yeah, that question is unfalsifiable. The problem of hard solipsism is an unfalsifiable one, and I'm not going to be able to falsify it. But my inability to falsify the unfalsifiable doesn't serve as evidence for your God, and it doesn't serve as a justification for you adding extra things that you are now just going to say that you can believe in without epistemic justification. The difference is, I'm not actually claiming for sure that the reality I'm living in is real, but you are claiming for certain that your God is real. I'm happy to admit that hard solipsism is unfalsifiable, but you claim to believe in this God. I'm not necessarily claiming that this reality is real. I don't know. It's an unfalsifiable question. Now, bringing it back to the questioner, what the questioner, and my interpretation here, Kane, and you can correct me if you think I've misunderstood them, because I want to give the questioner a fair hearing here. My sense of this question is, you guys can't even prove that the external world is real. So who are you to question the existence of moral facts? If you're going to believe that the external world is real, why can't I have my moral facts? And it's very similar to that apologist's approach, isn't it? And I just find this to be just a kind of a bad way of arguing, basically. The questioner is almost assuming, it seems to me, that arguments and worldviews are transactional. And, I'm going to allow you to believe that the external world is real only if you allow me to believe that moral facts are real. And that's the transaction. And I'll grant you yours if you grant me mine, and then we can all sing Kumbaya, my lord, and the rest is history. But that's not how arguments work. It might just be the case that we can't prove that the external world is real, and that we can't prove that moral facts are real. And that's it.
Right.
Right? It's not transactional. I don't know. What say you about that?
Yeah, for what it's worth, I mean, if somebody says to me, look, I just want to believe in moral facts, and that's that, and I'm just going to assume it, I would just say, okay, fine, I don't actually have a problem with that, so you can go ahead and do that. But that's obviously not an argument, right? It's not going to convince. It's not going to convince. It's not going to convince me. So you're more than welcome to hold just the assumption that there are moral facts. But if you want me to agree with you, I'd need more. I think that this questioner, I mean, I think the way I would see it, I think as I was interpreting it, they were sort of saying, well, look, it seems like, we both are making assumptions. So, like you're claiming that there are no moral facts, but you still believe in like some facts. So, for instance, maybe you think it's a fact that there are no moral facts, or at least you think it's a fact that maybe you have two hands or something. So we assume that there are facts, and similarly, in the context of maybe like ethical debates or whatever, we end up coming to just such strong agreements that we can end up saying, well, we can just assume that there are facts. I mean, again, if somebody just wants to make the assumption that there are facts in a certain domain, then okay, I mean, you're welcome to assume it. I'm not going to stop you.
I mean,
so yeah.
Another problem that I see here, though, is that even the questioner would have to agree that there are domains that are non-cognitive. So I don't know, take the example of film, right? It's the best film is not a fact. It is a matter of subjective preference and opinion, right?
Just for what it's worth, I mean, I'll just say, I mean, I know you're aware of this, but for the benefit of your viewers, there was a study that was done which basically gave professional philosophers a list of questions and got their opinions on things. It's called the Phil Papers Survey, and I should say that when it comes to aesthetic value, I think about 30% said that there were objective facts about aesthetic value. So they're actually, on that view, maybe there is actually a best film. But yeah, so some people would just say, no, I think there really is a best film in response to that.
Would they go so far as to say that there's a best color?
It's a good question. That seems really weird, right?
But yeah, red is the best color or something. So look, I'm sure most of our viewers will agree that one's favorite color, and just because they agree doesn't make it so. There's undoubtedly a very interesting philosophical debate to be had there in terms of aesthetic value. But I'm just going to go ahead and put my cards on the table. I think one's favorite color is ultimately a subjective matter, right? I would say it's the same with film. But let's just go with the color example, just to make it really, really simple. So the questioner would no doubt agree, I would imagine, that one's favorite color is subjective. So there are subjective domains, right? Even those who think aesthetic value might be objective, even those people might agree that there are subjective domains. They could perhaps give us an example of a subjective domain. All I'm saying is that morality is just another example of a subjective domain. It's another non-cognitive area where there are no facts to be known. And that's what's really weird about this question. So the questioner is kind of assuming that morality is a factual domain without really offering an argument. Although I will say they do point out that where's the sentence here? They say similarly, when the law of morality is broken, there's an equal and opposite reaction that accompanies it, and that you don't necessarily get away with it. There's always a backlash coming, and that this might serve as evidence of your objective wrongdoing. But I don't view it that way. If I feel guilty, again, I just feel like guilt is an expression of my attitudes. Or if I'm punished by society, that is just an expression of my societal context. What I get punished for in 2024 wouldn't necessarily what I'd be punished for in the 1500s or what have you. All of this is still ultimately explicable through an anti-realist lens. But this idea that morality must be a factual domain, I mean, all you need grant me is that there are subjective domains, color being one of them. There's no best color. If your favorite color is blue and my favorite color is red, there is no objective fact of the matter other than the fact that I have a cognitive state whereby my favorite color is X, and you have a cognitive state whereby your favorite color is X. But that doesn't mean that there's a stance independent fact in the world which makes one of those colors the best color out of all the colors. And I would say that the same is true for morality. This idea that morality must be a factual domain, right? The reason I bring this up, let me just reread this part, right? For one to claim there are no moral facts, one must first demonstrate that there are facts, and that is no easy thing. So this idea so nonetheless we assume there are facts, even if no one can be agreed upon beyond a reasonable doubt. So it would be unreasonable to question the existence of moral facts. Would it be unreasonable to question the existence of the best color? That would be my question to this questioner. Would it be unreasonable to doubt the existence of facts pertaining to what color is the best, or what color is right or wrong in a given context? Is there a factually incorrect outfit color that I can choose? Is there a factually incorrect combination? Is pink with yellow factually correct or incorrect? Is painting my house red factually incorrect? What is the factually best color that one can choose for their baby to wear when they're first born? Must I go with blue because it's a boy? Must I go with pink because it's a girl? When in the past, those colors were actually the other way around, or so I've been led to believe. Right? These things are clearly social conventions. One's favorite color is clearly a matter of subjectivity. And so this idea that we can just assert that morality is a factual domain just because we feel that something is wrong. I feel like wearing black with navy is wrong. I get that feeling when I wear those two colors. That doesn't mean that there's a fact of the matter. That doesn't mean that there's stance independent facts about color and what colors one ought and ought not wear, or what color you ought or ought not paint your house, or what color your car ought or ought not be when you purchase it, and so on. So I don't know if the color analogy works for you, Kane, but I find that very helpful for trying to explain to people where I'm coming from when I say that I'm a moral anti-realist. The fact that I might feel like I've transgressed a norm is no more convincing to me about the existence of moral facts than the fact that I feel like I've transgressed a norm when I wear a color combination that society disapproves of and that I've been indoctrinated into believing is improper. So anyway, just my 2 cents.
No, yeah, that's nicely stated.
So you would agree with that?
Yeah, I think that's a good. Yeah, pretty much. I mean, you could just as well say, yeah, for one to claim that there are no facts about the best color, one must first demonstrate that there are facts, etc. I mean, I don't think we would want to get on board with that. So
yeah, you could rewrite
we're just
the
saying
entire
the same
question
about the moral domain.
Yeah, you could rewrite the entire question and submit color for moral facts, and the question would read the same, right?
Mm-hmm.
So in my view, the questioner hasn't satisfactorily demonstrated the idea that moral facts fall into the cognitive domain, and appeals to feeling like we've transgressed norms aren't going to cut it no more than they would in the domain of color, as it were. So do you have anything else to add there, Kane, before we move on to the next question?
No, I'm happy to move on.
I'm realizing that we're probably not going to get through all of these questions.
Well, I've got I'm not doing anything else tonight, so you can take as long as you want. It's up to you.
Cool. I appreciate that, Kane. Thank you so much. So question 4 then comes from Lars Christian ALM. Why do people choose these usernames? Please don't misunderstand, Lars. I'm not having a go at you. This is more a symptom of my inability to read usernames, but there you go. I find it very difficult. But anyway, Lars Christian writes, genocide is factually harmful. It factually causes suffering. What say you, Kane?
Yeah, I think I agree with that. It does cause suffering. I'm happy to grant that. I don't take it that a moral anti-realist is going to deny that there are consequences of people's behaviors. So the fact that I can walk up to somebody and punch them in the face, that's going to cause them to experience pain, right? So I walk up to them, punch them in the face, and because of my action, they experience pain. Yeah, fine. Yeah. I mean, the question is, is it objectively wrong for me to punch them in the face? Is it the case that I have an objective obligation not to do that. Now, what I would say is well, I don't want to live in a world in which people go around punching each other in the face. When I see someone punching another person in the face, I feel negatively about that. But that's my reaction to the sort of thing that follows from someone being punched in the face. But I don't think that from that alone we can make any claims about there being objective values.
Sure, and this could be complicated even further by just introducing some specifics. One might not hesitate to agree with punching somebody in the face if the person being punched in the face were a thief who was trying to rob an old woman, or if they were some kind of a predator preying upon children for reasons and ideas we won't get into for fear of having my channel deleted. So yeah, it gets complicated by all those sorts of things. But yeah, I straightforwardly agree with the statement. Yes, it is factually harmful and it does cause suffering, but that isn't actually enough to demonstrate that something is objectively immoral. It's not enough to demonstrate the existence of moral facts. I think some people, and I think this question demonstrates this, perhaps, maybe I'm reading into it too much. You can be the judge here, Kane. But I think some people are such natural utilitarians that utilitarianism is baked into the very core of how they think. And I think there's actually good, evolutionary reason for that. I think a lot of people are walking around and they're just unconsciously utilitarian in their thinking. And I think we're seeing that expressed in this question. I think this questioner, correct me if I'm wrong, seems to be assuming that they are accomplishing some kind of meta-ethical feat here by pointing out the trivial observation that genocide causes harm, something which we, of course, agree with. But they appear, it seems to me, they appear to be assuming that they have accomplished more than just stating a fact here. And it might be because they're a utilitarian. What do you think about that?
So it's certainly possible for somebody to say that, look, when we say things like, this action is good or this action is bad, all we are doing is making claims about, pleasure, pain, happiness, suffering. So that, when I say giving to charity is good, all that means, all I'm communicating is giving to charity promotes happiness. When I say genocide is bad, all I'm communicating is that genocide causes suffering or something like that. So basically we would be saying that these moral terms like good and bad, like they just mean nothing more than claims about pleasure and pain or happiness and suffering. So I think that so there's a few issues with that. I mean, first of all, if you adopt that sort of view of the meaning of moral terms, then it becomes very hard to say what's going on when you enter into a debate with somebody who has just a very different sort of moral framework. In fact, by your standards, if you come across somebody who's like a deontologist or something, and so you basically have to say that person just isn't really using moral language at all. It's not even a moral debate. They're just maybe they're just using the terms wrong, which seems a bit strange.
A deontological ethicist, just for the viewer in case they're not aware, correct me if I'm wrong, Kane, that's a person who views morality through the lens of rule following, that morality is about following a set of rules, independent of whether or not those rules lead to pain or pleasure. One must follow the rules. So like a Kantian ethicist following a categorical imperative. It takes the form of just do X, that kind of thing.
So for the Kant, I mean, the famous example that's sometimes used to object to Kantianism is that the Kantian might say that lying is always wrong, even when you're hiding like a Jewish family in your house, and then there's the Nazi comes to the door and wants to know whether, even in that situation, the Kantian would have to tell the truth. Now, actually, that might be a little bit of a straw man of Kantianism, but it makes the point that Kantianism is a theory where, I mean, these are people who have thought very carefully about this, and they've evaluated the arguments, and they are using moral language to communicate something other than just claims about what causes pleasure or what causes pain. But I would also say, additionally, even if you accept this view that, you know, what's good is just a matter of what promotes pleasure and what's bad is just a matter of what causes pain, that doesn't actually get you any claim about what duties or obligations I have. That doesn't tell you anything about what I ought to do, because you know it might well be that like an action is bad, right? But it's another claim to then say that I objectively ought not to do it. So there's a distinction we can draw between uh, sort of values and oughts. And then like moral theories will tell you something about what's good and bad, and they will also tell you something about what you ought and ought not to do. So I think even if I were to even if I was to get on board with this naturalist idea that genocide is objectively bad just because it causes suffering, I don't think you get any claim about what people ought or ought not to do from that. That would be a separate claim. So maybe that answers the if this is what that user was suggesting at. Does that make sense? Maybe that.
No, it makes perfect sense. I was reminded there when you were speaking, Kane, about the is ought problem. So, like, even if it is the case that something is extraordinarily painful, or even if it is the case that something is extraordinarily pleasurable, it doesn't follow that therefore one ought to do anything about that.
Yeah.
I mean, that just logically speaking, that just doesn't follow, because logic is conservative. If I take A plus A plus A plus A plus A, if I keep adding A's, I'm never going to get to B. Logic is conservative. It's garbage in, garbage out. And that's just how it works. You cannot have something in your conclusion that was not already in your premises. That's just the way logic works. It's conservative. So this idea that utilitarians have, whereby you're going to tell me the, hedonic profile, if you will, of a particular action and the consequences it will result in. So it will lead to this action will lead to a net positive amount of pleasure for the majority of people involved. Let's forget about the minor few who will be screwed over by this, by the way, another huge problem with utilitarianism that we could get into. But let's just assume that action X leads to the net positive pleasure for the majority of people involved. So what? That doesn't mean that I ought to do that. You can tell me all of the facts about how this will lead to pleasure for the majority of the individuals, and it doesn't follow by virtue of logic alone. It doesn't follow that therefore we ought do that. You have to navigate the is ought gap. You can't just assume that you've crossed it just because you're a naturalist or just because you're a utilitarian. It just doesn't work that way.
So I sometimes I kind of extend this a little bit sometimes by talking about the value ought gap. That there's not just an is ought gap, there's a value ought gap.
I love this. Yes, please,
yeah.
please
Tell
us that. You've said this before.
Have I said it before?
I know, I love this point, so I would relish hearing it again. Please go right ahead.
Well, I mean, the basic idea would be this, so if you state the proposition that genocide is bad, right? That's okay. Let's just grant this proposition, and let's grant that it's objectively true. So I mean, it's a fact. It is a fact about the world that genocide is bad. Okay, how do you then get to the proposition that you ought not to commit genocide? I mean, if you just say, well, genocide is bad, therefore you ought not to commit genocide. That's not a valid argument, right? There's not any obvious reason why I ought not to do things that are bad. I mean, consider it in a slightly different context, right? Like think about, I don't know, artworks. We might well judge that a particular artwork is just rubbish, but we don't usually think that there's some sort of obligation not to create bad art. So I might say like this movie is bad, and maybe I'm an objectivist about the value there. Maybe I'm one of those 30% or so philosophers who think that, yeah, there really are objectively bad works of art. I've never encountered anyone who says, yeah, but there's an obligation, right? You ought not to create bad works of art. So I think that, even once we get on board with the idea of objective values, you actually still have got some work to do if you want to get all the way to objective obligations.
Because of the conservative nature of logic that I just explained, right? So even if I grant that the Holocaust is bad as a matter of fact, you still can't get from that fact to therefore one ought not do it. because, again, logic is conservative. Garbage in, garbage out. You cannot get an ought from an is, even if that is a moral fact, right?
What you would need, I mean, if you say something, so maybe we say that like genocide causes more suffering than it does pleasure. Well, in order to get to the claim that you ought not to commit genocide, you then need some moral proposition, like you ought not to do things that cause greater suffering than pleasure, or you ought not to do things that cause more bad over good. So that claim, you ought not to do things that cause more bad over good. I mean, that's a contentious claim. A Kantian would deny that, and at least in some circumstances, they wouldn't say that that's like universally true. But certainly, I mean, as an anti-realist, I would just say, well, that sort of claim, you ought not to do things that cause more bad over good, I would see that as an expression of sentiment. So that's even if somehow you were to get me on board with the idea of objective values.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Shall we move on to the next question?
Sure. Can I eat? Do you mind if I eat a banana?
Be my guest. Be my guest. That's totally fine. I'm kind of jealous that you're having a banana right now, actually. I wish I brought a banana. So question 5 comes from K. Din Konzak. Again, usernames, guys. Simplify. Just simplify, please. So Caden Konzak, 1840. I think I got it better the second time. And I quote, "I think it is likely the case that people being genocided would interpret those actions against them as morally abhorrent." I think you're right. But that doesn't mean that there is a fact about morality which is being exemplified in that scenario. Just that most humans will likely have a similar emotional experience to being subjugated and extrajudicially executed, which may be viewed as a fact about their psychology, but not of morality. I am curious what your response would be to someone who claims these psychological facts are equivalent to moral facts. I am anticipating a few responses I would give to this argument, but I will leave this off here. Lol. So it sounds like this questioner is an anti-realist, and they're on our side here, and they're just asking a question for the fun of it, and their question pertains to the psychological profile of the people being harmed. So it is a fact that they are experiencing pain. That's objectively verifiable, measurable, and it is a fact that correlates to a brain state. And so their question is, are these psychological facts the equivalent of moral facts? What say you, Ken?
I mean, this is a tricky one because it's a little bit unclear how to elaborate the theory that we're being asked to respond to. So, I mean, I suppose the simplest way to take it would just be something like, well, the moral facts are equivalent to facts about how people, so people have like effective responses to things. There are things that can happen to me which cause me to experience states of pleasure, and things that happen that cause me to experience states of suffering. And then one thing we might say is, well, the moral facts are just equivalent to my states of pleasure and states of suffering. So like when I experience pleasure, that's good. When I experience suffering, that's morally bad. Now that kind of view would just be the kind of naturalism that we were just talking about. So I guess we've already answered that, right, in response to the previous question. But that's not necessarily the only way that we could view this. So, one other way of viewing this would be something like, look, people have, evolved to conform to certain norms. So there are just certain like basic evaluative tendencies that we have as a result of our like evolutionary history, and then maybe we want to say something like the sorts of norms that kind of promote the survival and reproduction of the species, and so that have been like ingrained in us psychologically, like that. Those are what determine the moral facts. The danger with this kind of view is that you might end up with I'll just point out, I mean, beyond any question about the meta-ethics, you might well end up with a kind of moral realism that you really don't want, because there are a lot of things about, you know, the sort of norms and kind of psychological tendencies that people have, which really it seems like we want to oppose. I mean, the fact that people are extremely tribalistic and xenophobic, and I mean, look, it's at least there is at least some reasonable argument that, you know, human beings might have a tendency to, you know, although they maybe will behave very well to members that are identified as being part of the in group, like maybe we just have some psychological tendency to like be violent and aggressive to members of the out group. If we look at human history, that actually seems to be the norm. You know, it's pretty depressing. And I think it's wonderful that we have managed to some extent to overcome that in the modern world. But
it's a miracle.
Yeah, exactly, right. So you know, when like, do we want to say, well, I mean, I guess my reaction to this would be, if that's what the moral facts are, then I don't see why the moral facts would be something, you know, worth following. I mean, I would just say, well, you know, that seems awful. It's kind of like you know, sometimes like atheists will say to theists, you know, if somebody's a Christian, right, an atheist might say, well, you know, even if you give me good reason to believe that this God exists, I'm looking at what it says in the Bible, and he sounds awful. So, you know, like I'm not like, screw that. I'm not going to worship this guy. And I guess I would have the same reaction to this conception of moral facts. If the conception of moral facts in question is, well, these are just things that have been like inculcated by our, you know, evolutionary history, and so we have these psychological tendencies. That doesn't sound good to me. Actually, I want to resist a lot of that stuff. So
yeah, I think that's a great point. The first thought that occurred to me when I read this question was, well, you're just, the questioner is only focusing on the mindset of the victims in the Holocaust, in the genocide, and their feelings of being subjugated, and as the questioner points out, they're likely to feel like something abhorrent is happening to them. And if that then becomes synonymous with the moral facts, I can just repose the question about the mindset of those who are genociding the victims, people who might be experiencing a sense of pleasure as a consequence of carrying out this abhorrent act, people who feel forthright and righteous in carrying out this act. So then I'm left as a third party viewer. I've got these moral facts over here of the victims who are feeling victimized and downtrodden and abused and brutalized. But then, so those are moral facts. But now I've also got these other moral facts over here of the victimizers who feel forthright and just and decent, and they feel like they're taking out the trash, getting rid of the vermin, the Untermensch, or what have you. And if these mindsets are the equivalent of moral facts, well, then we're at a push, aren't we? Which moral facts are now ascendant? Which moral facts are correct? Which moral facts must one follow? Which ones should win out in the end? You see the kind of problem I'm articulating here? It's not obvious that this gets us to a very clear you know, moral framework.
I mean, what I think what, you know, what most moral realists would want is kind of universal moral facts, right? We don't want to say that the moral facts are just relative to whatever, you know, it's just like particular groups or particular people. Indeed, by the usual way that philosophers divide these things up, that kind of relativism just wouldn't be moral realism. But I think even if you say that, you know, you might just say, if you try to sort of plump for one of these groups, if you say, well, you know, it's the sort of psychology of the victims that determines the moral facts, you should notice that the victim and the oppressor can swap very easily. Like, you look at what happened in Rwanda, right? I think it was the Hutus? The Hutus were oppressed for a very long time. But then, you know, the situation flipped, and you had the Hutus genociding the Tutsis. Like, I don't know what happened there. Like, was it the Hutus? Was it their psychologies who determined the moral facts while they were being oppressed? And then when the situation flipped, the moral facts started getting determined by the Tutsis. That's very strange, right?
It gets messy. It gets very, very messy. I think we're both agreed here that this isn't going to be a very stable or coherent framework for establishing moral facts, if it can even establish moral facts to begin with. So,
right.
Yeah. With that said, should we move on to the next question?
Happy to do so.
Question 6. This is a weird one. So, Rasput is 5802 writes, veganism is morally superior. Okay.
I would just take that as an expression of their moral
Attitudes.
attitudes, and I'm perfectly fine with people expressing moral attitudes. There's no conflict with anti-realism there. So I would just say okay, but I think that's a different topic.
Yeah, it reminds me of a joke that I heard. How can you tell that somebody is vegan? And then somebody says, how they'll fucking tell you. Exemplified by this question. And by the way, that's not a jab at vegans. I'm actually very sympathetic to the vegan worldview, whilst not being a vegan myself. But as you pointed out, Kane, this is kind of beyond the scope of our conversation here tonight. So let's move on to the next question, shall we? Okay, so question 7, which comes from Kevitsky, or Kevitsky, and I quote, personally, I can't conceive of a situation where that is permissible. Could there be? I don't know. I, however, take a stance against it. If I may pose some questions for the interest of it being discussed both in your interview and in the comments section. How do you define a moral fact? Is it different or the same as a natural world fact? Is it a fact based on social interactions within your group, or is it merely a phenomenon that you have observed and judged to be best? And secondly, is morality based on consequences, duties, intent, or any combination of the above? Which of the three is most important? So what do you think, Kane? I feel like this question might be a question for moral realists as opposed to anti-realists. But when you're talking about moral facts, like, what is a moral fact? I mean,
so I should first of all just say, because the very first thing that they said was, personally, I can't conceive of a situation where that is permissible. Could there be? I think they were talking about genocide there.
Yes, correct. Yeah.
And I mean, just for what it's worth, I agree. I'm just opposed to genocide across the board.
Likewise.
So, I mean, maybe there's like some really fantastical scenario where, I don't know. It's like, I actually don't know. I mean, I feel like causing that much suffering, even if you were to somehow get like billions and billions and billions of people pleasure or something, it wouldn't be worth it. But that's just me. So I'm opposed to genocide. But with the thing about how you define a moral fact, well, yeah, I mean, as you kind of hinted at there, I would see this as being really the burden of the opponent, right? So if you ask me, like, what my take on morality is, I would say something like, well, look, I think that people have sort of emotional reactions to things. I have sentiments. And, one of the things I'm doing when I make moral judgments is I'm expressing these sentiments. Another thing that I can do is like reason about what sort of world would best promote my own self-interest. So I can kind of just recognize that, even though there are some people that I really would like to just murder, I don't want to be murdered. Okay, so I'm going to agree to sort of follow a rule that we don't murder each other because I don't want to be murdered, right? So it's like a combination of sort of sentiment and what would promote my own well-being. That's how I get to these moral claims. Now, the realists, of course, they're saying something different. They're saying, well, no, what we're doing is we're reasoning about the way the world is. We're reasoning about facts, and it's kind of on them to explain how that works. Now, different realists will say different things. So there are some realists who are naturalists, right? They will say that the moral facts are natural facts. There are some realists who will even say that we can, like literally perceive moral facts. I find this idea a little bit puzzling, but some of them do say that, right? Some of them will say that, like, if you look at somebody, being enslaved, then you literally perceive the wrongness. So it's just like moral facts are observable in much the same way that any other fact, that other sort of natural facts are. Then some realists will argue that, there are moral facts, but they are these like abstract, non-natural things.
Intuition.
I mean, so you know them via intuition. Yeah, like you have a kind of it's a sort of intellectual a kind of intellectual revealing of the moral of these moral truths.
G.E. Moore and company.
Yep. Then there are some realists who will say that we can, maybe use God to ground the moral facts, like a divine command theory. That's often framed in realist terms. So, I mean, I myself, like, I don't take any particular analysis as gospel here, right? I'm happy to say, well, there are these different accounts of moral facts, and I have different objections to them. And I will leave it up to the opponent to go with whatever they think the best option is. I worry that if I was to, so here's my worry: if I was to stipulate some account of moral facts, like before I even engage in the conversation, then I think there would be a danger of just straw manning the other person, right? Like if I say,
Agreed.
well, yeah, the moral facts just have to be non-natural facts. So if you say there are moral facts, you're committed to this, like, weird, weird, like, non-natural stuff that can't be established empirically, and weird faculty of intuition. That would be kind of unfair, because there are some realists who are explicitly trying to avoid that. So,
yeah, I think that's well said. The second question that they asked was, is morality based on consequences, duties, intent, or any combination of the above? And again, I think that just depends on the person you're speaking with. So if you speak to a utilitarian, they are consequentialist. If you speak to a deontological ethicist, like a Kantian, as we referred to earlier, they are going to view morality through the lens of duty and so on. And there are theories, although this is not an area that I'm familiar with. Apparently, there are theories that try to combine consequentialism and the so-called hybrid theories that combine consequentialism and deontological ethics, but I'm not familiar with those myself, so I can't comment. Perhaps Kane can elucidate on that a small bit. But which is the most important? Truthfully, it varies for me. Sometimes I find myself having a very strong reaction to something because I'm imagining the consequences, and I can see that those consequences are terrible. So I have a very strong, it's repellent to me. But other times I just have a very strong intuition or attitude that something is wrong, even though it might not even have a terrible consequence. I feel like there's just like an a priori rejection of something. It's hard to explain, and it's a question I would love to ask you, Kane. When you're evaluating, if only subjectively, if only as an expression of your attitudes, what is it? And that's why I think this question is fascinating. What is it that you're prioritizing? Do you mostly prioritize consequences, or do you feel like there are just some norms that for you are a line that you would not cross regardless of consequences, leaning more in like a Kantian direction or something? Or is it some mixture of the two? How does this operate in your psyche? I would love to know.
Yeah, I mean, just to be clear, this is one of those cases where one has to be careful of, when we're having a discussion about metaethics, we have to be careful of normative entanglement.
I suppose I'm guilty of that right now. That's a fair point.
I mean, not necessarily. It's just like, whether you are a realist or an anti-realist, you can debate the ethics, right? You can hold maybe utilitarianism or Kantianism from within either an anti-realist or a realist framework.
So let me sharpen up the question. When you're doing ethics, not meta-ethics, just to avoid the entanglement issue. So when you're thinking ethically, not meta-ethically, when you're evaluating whether or not you ought or ought not do something, do you think about it in terms of consequences or duties, or how do you go about thinking through the rightness and wrongness of actions?
I think for me, it's going to be some sort of mixture of them. I mean, mostly I just sort of have, I just feel, the way I put it is, look, I feel ways about things. I have kind of intuitions, and I can, if I'm challenged on any of my views, I will sort of try to give arguments for them that appeal to principles that the other person hopefully also accepts. But for me, I'm not one of these people who like has an ethical theory. I've never really been. I've never really gotten on board with that. Like, so there are some people who say, well, look, these are the sort of basic principles that that I'm going to commit to, and then I'm just going to do whatever follows from them. So, like, if you're a utilitarian, you'll say greatest happiness for the greatest number, and then you just kind of follow that whatever it entails in any given context, that's what you do, at least ideally. But no, I mean, I've just never been like that, right? I have different reactions in different situations, and to be honest, I mean, very often it's hard to, identify what the principle is that's underlying my reactions to things. I mean, but yeah, I guess it's going to end up being things like, well, proximity matters, for instance. So, if I happen to like actually see somebody drowning in a pond, then I'm going to be like maybe motivated to go and help them. If I like walk, if I'm just out walking, I see somebody starving to death, then I will give them food, right? But on the other hand, I know that there are people starving to death in other countries, and I'm not doing anywhere near as much as I could to try to solve that problem.
Yeah.
And that doesn't really bother me. So there must be some like proximity thing going on here. So it's like, yeah, on the one hand, I would rather live in a world where people aren't starving. At the same time, I'm not really doing much I'm not actually doing anything to solve that problem, to be honest. So it's just a sort of big, vague kind of jumble, and that's not going to be satisfying for people who want a moral theory. I do want to be clear that there are many anti-realists who can get on board with the moral theorizing. So this is just this isn't my my failure to engage in moral theorizing is not a product of my anti-realism. That's just a product of my personal idiosyncrasies. If you want moral theorizing, there are anti-realists who will get on board with that stuff. But it's just that's not me. I basically just have intuitions and feelings, and then I just kind of do whatever I want in the moment. So it's a good thing that I have quite pro-social sentiments, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, I have to admit, I felt like you were telling my story as you spoke there, because I feel like I'm in very much the same headspace as you. I don't self-identify with any specific non-cognitivist meta-ethical viewpoint like emotivism or something. I mean, I don't know. Yeah, like you, it's kind of I react differently to different situations as a consequence of my own idiosyncrasies, and sometimes I find myself intuitively appealing to consequences a la a utilitarian viewpoint, and sometimes I just feel like something it's just wrong regardless of consequences, and yeah, it's just a jumble. But it's something I've never really felt any kind of necessity to sort out. It's not like I mean, it's not relevant really for me to sort that out. I'm interested in this topic in the kind of macro insofar as whether or not moral facts exist.
Yeah.
Given that I am an anti-realist, it's not necessary that I tie myself to any specific meta-ethical theory. I don't see that as being necessary. But perhaps as my studies continue, I will find myself being drawn to a non-cognitivist theory. Hell, perhaps as I continue my study, I could become a moral realist at the end. Who the hell knows? Hope springs eternal. So let's move on to question 8 then, Kane, yeah?
Yep.
So Curious Little Birdie writes, it's factually incorrect if your goals are things like peace, happiness, prosperity, education, or the well-being of conscious creatures in general. You have to propose an if first, then you can determine an objective ought. If you have 2 and you want 4, then you ought to add 2 more to what you have. If you want your dog to continue living, you ought to feed it. If you want to reduce school, we won't read that word, for the sake of monetization, you ought to pass legislation restricting firearms to those with histories of domestic violence. You can get progressively more and more complex with your oughts, the more statistics you gather relevant to you, ifs or goals. So long story short, morality is objective under the condition that we aren't using philosophy to be deliberately obtuse, and we identify our common goals. And before anybody says, well, what if if a psychopath's goal is to eat as many babies as possible or whatever, just know that is precisely what I mean about using philosophy to be obtuse. The morality of psychopaths isn't an interesting subject. It's a red herring. So what say you, Kane? Are we being obtuse?
Okay, yeah, there's a lot to say there. I mean, I guess I may end up being a little bit rude in my answer, but I would just say to the question that you kind of did start it. But I'll try to put this as diplomatically as I can. So I think that we're talking about moral realism, moral anti-realism. That's a philosophical debate, and you don't have to be interested in that. Lots of people aren't interested in philosophy. It's totally fine. It's perfectly fine for someone to say, look, I just care about figuring out how to promote economic prosperity, how to stop racism, whatever. I'm just going to focus on that. I don't care about these questions about whether these are objective facts or just expressions of sentiment or whatever. That is totally fine. Different people have different interests. Cool. And so if you're not interested in the philosophy, that's totally cool. But it is not an argument against my position that you're not interested in the conversation. So I mean, I that's all I can say to the point about philosophy being obtuse. With respect to psychopaths, though, I would say, well, I think even from a sort of more pragmatist point of view, it's maybe you're kind of shooting yourself in the foot with how dismissive you are of psychopaths, because whether you like it or not, we do in fact live in a world that contains psychopaths, and it seems like there might be quite a lot of them, and it seems like if some of the psychological evidence is to be believed, although some psychopaths are sort of unable to control themselves and they're impulsive and so on, there are lots of them who seem to gain positions of power. So to just say, well, I'm just going to ignore psychopaths, we don't have to think about them, that seems like a mistake. I mean, I would have thought that you would want to you'd want to figure out okay, how are psychopaths thinking? Are there ways that we can what can we do to sort of persuade psychopaths to follow the sorts of rules that we would prefer everybody to follow? Are there ways of improving empathy and so on? So yeah, I mean, even just from the kind of anti-philosophy, pragmatist kind of attitude that you're expressing there, I think it's a mistake to be dismissive of psychopaths. So that's my that's my response to the final thing you said. Now, with respect to okay, you say you have to propose an if first, then you can determine an objective ought. If you have 2 and you want 4, then you ought to add 2 more to what you have. So this kind of thing is actually something that anti-realists often get on board with. So the idea would be that this is a kind of hypothetical imperative. You're saying, if you want X, then you ought to do Y, right? So we have a particular goal to get X, and then I can recognize that there are means of achieving that goal. And that's fine, right? I mean, that's something that anti-realists can acknowledge. What's in debate is whether or not there are goals that we objectively ought to have. So, it's not just okay, if you have 2 and you want 4. So the goal is, I want 4. But now, what a moral realist will say is, you objectively ought to have 4. So it's not just that you happen to desire having 4 things. It's you objectively ought to have these 4 things. And that's where the dispute is. I would just point out, though, that I'm actually not so comfortable using this term ought at all here, just because I think that really what I'm inclined to say is look, just as a sort of matter of human psychology, right? I just will do stuff that attempts to realize whatever my desires are. If I have the desire for, if I have the desire for 4 items, then, once I recognize that I have 2 items and I need another 2 items, I just will be motivated to, get those other 2 items. But then to say, well, you ought, okay, you desire to have 4 items, so you ought to get another 2 items. There's a danger there of this normative entanglement thing that we've talked about. So I would just the way I would prefer to frame things is people have goals, and there are means of achieving those goals, and that is something that anti-realists can totally get on board with. And of course, you can be right or wrong about what are effective means of achieving your goals. And so, if you say to me, well, look, you ought not to commit genocide. If what you're saying there is that, we all want to live in a society in which people are happy and healthy and free, and genocide would obviously prevent that sort of society from existing. Yeah, totally on board with that. So I think so that sort of thing I think is not really in conflict with anti-realism.
Yeah, I must admit I share your frustration with the questioner here, and the irony. I'm so happy that you translated their username for me, because the irony in being called the curious little birdie when you're not curious about philosophy, when you're going to have this antagonistic style of parlance in relation to philosophy, I'm going to go ahead and say it doesn't sound like you're very curious in that case, right? You're showing up to the philosophical dialogue and then saying I'm not interested in the philosophical dialogue. Showing up to the philosophical dialogue and pointing out that anybody who disagrees with you is just being obtuse. I'm sorry, but that doesn't admit of the philosophical spirit that I'm thinking of and trying to foster on my channel, and I know that you're trying to foster on yours, Kane. Can you imagine how my subscribers would react? Or Kane, could you imagine how your subscribers would react if your next video consisted of you tabling a contentious issue and then just pointing out that, well, anybody who disagrees with my point of view on this is being philosophically obtuse. End of video. Are you fucking kidding me? Like, are you for real? It's just, yeah. I'm being more rude than you were being.
It occurred to me that I was going to try to be rude, but I didn't manage it, did I? I actually gave a very polite response.
you were quite polite, to be fair to you. You were quite polite. Don't worry, I'll open the rudeness door. This is a fucking ridiculous point of view. Let me just say, this is a ridiculous point of view. I'm so sick of this, you see, and forgive me, curious little birdie. I must admit, I feel like this questioner is. I very much appreciate them submitting the question, and that's very, very kind of them. And this is not at all an attack on your character or you as a person more generally. All I'm attacking here is this specific view that you've articulated. So it's very important right now that you differentiate yourself from the view. Here you are. Here's the view. I'm all good with this. It's this over here that I have a problem with. It's the view that I think is incredibly problematic. Calling me philosophically obtuse because I disagree with you about this is just insulting. I mean, it's not very intellectual. So you've come to a channel which is about philosophy. You've commented on a community post which has informed you in advance that we're going to be having a philosophical dialogue about realism and anti-realism, and your contribution is to suggest that anybody who disagrees with you is being philosophically obtuse. Well, I don't know. I think I've made it clear what I think about that, and suffice to say, I don't think very positive things about such a viewpoint. Did you have anything else you wanted to add there, Kane, before we move on?
I think that was everything there. Yeah. So nothing more to say.
Fantastic. All right, let's move on to question 9 then. Question 9 comes from a name that I can read. Stanley Hyde, 8529, writes, and I quote, I've said it hundreds of times, quality of life is the guide stick I use to define morality. It's as close as I think you could get to a factual basis for how it could be. There are things that are required to be able to survive: food, water, and shelter. Everyone knows this, and I think you can safely call this a fact. If your actions impede or stall them, then they are factually amoral by my understanding. Maybe they meant immoral there. Take the example you gave. By my frame of thinking, you couldn't be any more wrong. Genocide is factually incorrect. Millions of lives snuffed out, stripped of anything that has value and meaning, then murdered. Maybe I'm wrong. Not that's clearly a typo of some description. I think what they're saying here is maybe I'm wrong in what constitutes a fact. Maybe I just put more weight on quality of life than others do for this point. I'm not sure, but I'm curious to see where this goes. Any thoughts there, Kane? What are you thinking?
Yeah, well, I think that I mean, if the questioner has been following the discussion so far, hopefully things have been kind of clarified a little bit, right?
Mm.
So like, look, no objection at all to the point that we can specify particular goals and then figure out how to achieve them. And you know what? The thing that's quite nice is that the vast majority of us seem to share similar goals in certain respects. Like one of the things it seems like we all want is food and water and shelter and so on. And so we can think about how to structure society in order to achieve that. And there really is nothing there that's in conflict with anti-realism. At one point, I mean, I would make just about this is I think there can be. So here's the thing: in principle, it could be the case that like everybody has the same sentiment about everything. So like imagine a world where like literally everybody agrees that we ought to have this particular political system, and we ought to act so as to make sure that everybody has food and water and shelter, and they do in fact achieve that, and so there's just universal agreement. Even in that world, you could you could still be an anti-realist, because the question of moral realism versus anti-realism, I mean, one way to think about it is almost it's like a question about location, right? It's like the anti-realist is saying that like morality is a matter of people's sentiments and feelings or thoughts, whereas the realist is saying, well, no, it's independent of the people. It's like something out there that they're trying to match. So like even if everybody agreed, that could still just be that everybody happens to share the same sentiments.
I used the color analogy. Sorry to interject here. I used the color analogy for this. Just quick interjection. Imagine a possible world where every human agrees that red is the best color.
Right.
It wouldn't suddenly mean that color were an objective domain where red is now factually the best color. It would just be the case in that possible world that everybody's subjective opinion about the best color aligns. And yet it wouldn't make color a factual domain. So anyway, go ahead.
I mean, just one other slight point that is worth keeping in mind, though, is I think that there's a danger of overstating like how much agreement there actually is when it comes to sentiments and values, though. I mean, so usually in response to this, I just kind of grant the point, so like I'll just be like, yeah, we all agree that like food, water, shelter is good. But to be honest, I mean, when I look at human history, it really seems to me like, no, people have radically different moral views. I mean, it seems to me like there are plenty of people who just, will have really like viciously aggressive views towards outsiders. Or, when you think about things like infanticide, there have been many, many societies historically that have practiced infanticide. Now, what you might say about that is, well, in the societies where people practiced infanticide, that was just because they like had no choice. The sort of material circumstances were such that they just were not able to feed more children. So, they just had to, they didn't have like birth control like we have now. So they just had to kill their children. I don't think that really works, though, because when you look at the societies in which have practiced infanticide, what you tend to find is that people don't see it as being even a problem. Like it's not really a big deal. Whereas, if somebody in the West, like in like this country, I live in the UK. If somebody who was like brought up in the UK was forced by material circumstances to kill their child, that would just be like horror. I mean, it would just destroy them, probably. So I think that you do find very deep conflicts in values. But again, that's kind of beside the point of moral realism, anti-realism, but I would just bear that in mind. So, it's perfectly fine, for, as you say, quality of life, food, water, shelter, that sort of thing is what you use to define morality. Okay. I would agree that there are, facts about how to best achieve that.
Indeed. So, in other words, just to summarize your point there, Kane, correct me if I'm wrong. If we lived in a world where everybody agreed on those things, you still wouldn't have established the existence of moral facts, no more than you would have established the existence of color facts in the world where everybody agrees that red is the best color.
Yeah.
But we don't even live in that world where everybody agrees on those things. The opinions on the ground are actually radically diverse, and people disagree on some of the most fundamental things. I think perhaps some people, it comes from a place of innocence. I think I'm not trying to condescend here. I actually think it's quite a beautiful thing. I encountered this in my students in school all the time. They'll, when they're first learning about the Holocaust, they'll say things like, but why would they kill someone just because of their religion? And there's something so adorable about that. And I don't mean that condescendingly. I mean that literally. Pardon me. There's something really quite precious about that, something that I really love. There's something endearing about that kind of innocence, where all they're really revealing is that they have a good, in my opinion, they have a good moral compass, that they're a decent, loving, kind, and compassionate human being. So much so that evil is incomprehensible to them. And I love that. People like that warm my heart, and they restore my faith in humanity. And I think this questioner might be coming from that angle ever so slightly. It's like the evils that are committed by human beings are almost unfathomable to them. So they're assuming that there's moral consensus on certain bedrock ideas, as they might think about them, when in reality there actually isn't. We're a very, very divided species, and there's people on this planet who are willing to engage in actions that you and I and the questioner would probably agree are abhorrent and brutal, unpleasant and disgraceful.
Or just bizarre, like people just do stuff that's like, wait, why on earth do you care about that?
Yeah, indeed. So yeah, I think that's that question addressed. Let's see. So let's move on to question 10. So this comes from a person who's already submitted a question. So Tempestive1 writes, and I quote, "I would say there's no inherent value. Value is given to us as is given by us, to us."
By us, I think. Value is given by us as individuals or societies.
Oh, thank you, Kane. I appreciate it. Sorry, I misunderstood that. However, from the moment the innocent values their well-being, it becomes a moral obligation as fellow humans who would generally like the same courtesy to be extended to us, to respect that given value. Look into evolutionary biology of social species, for one. I don't know how well defined the lines one can draw here are. I'd say, like most things in life, I think they mean there's a continuum. We slide along as individuals and communities, but we can always aim to do better. So I think this question has been in part answered by your thoughts about evolution earlier. So would we really want to live in a world that was governed by so-called evolutionarily rendered values?
I don't think so.
Yeah.
But I mean, I would say that there's a more general kind of point being made here, which I think is something I would agree. I mean, obviously, I agree there's no like inherent value, but that this idea that, okay, there's an innocent person, let's say, who values their well-being, and then, well, we should respect that because we want the same sort of courtesy to be extended to us. I mean, that kind of reasoning, I think, that's how you get to a lot of moral claims, and I don't think it really requires assuming that there's objective values. I think all it requires is just recognizing that, even if I am totally self-interested and I don't care about other people, I am vulnerable to other people. So, it's in my self-interest if I live in a society which is governed by certain rules, where, it's like everybody, I want it to be the case that everybody else follows the rule that they do not beat me up and take my clothes, for instance, right? And so, I'm gonna agree to follow that rule as well, because that's the only way that works, right? You're only going to get everybody on board with the rule if everybody's agreeing to follow it. We at least a sufficient number of people. I'm better off in that kind of world, and so I can kind of reason my way to these to these sorts of moral rules, even from a purely self-interested point of view. And then when you add on to that the fact that, you know, we're not purely self-interested in insofar as we do have like emotional connections to other people. I think that goes really as far as you need to go in terms of accounting for the sorts of moral behaviors that we see.
Indeed. Allow me to be philosophically obtuse, much to the chagrin of a previous questioner. It's actually logically invalid, isn't it? To say that, like, if somebody expresses it as a syllogism, so if somebody were to say, for example, you know, I want to be treated well, so therefore I ought to treat others well. No, actually, that doesn't follow logically at all, right?
No,
Like I could just as easily say, I want to be treated well, and I can treat others like shit. Now, I wouldn't like that person, and I would hope nobody would view me as such a person. And again, this is all just my subjective preferences here and expressions of my attitudes. But I just think it's important to draw attention here, because sometimes this like golden rule idea gets granted almost by default. Treat others how you want to be treated and so on. And I think that's a good rule to live by. You could choose a worse ethical norm to follow, but it isn't logically valid. There is absolutely no, it doesn't win out over the exact opposite, where I should treat others in the opposite to how I would like to be treated, right? And there's no objective fact of the matter which renders that way of living false, as it were.
No, I mean the danger of living like that, I think, is like it's a sort of practical danger, right? I mean, okay. So let's say that I'm purely self-interested. I want to be treated well, and then I say, but I'm also going to treat others like shit. Well, probably what's going to happen if I treat others like shit is that they start treating me badly. I mean, I guess there are maybe some people who can avoid, like if you're like a dictator or something.
Kings come to mind immediately, and certain celebrities
can probably avoid it. Yeah,
certain celebrities with awesome power. Jimmy Savile lived a life of absolute debauchery and committed terrible acts against children, some of whom were sick in hospitals and so on, and got away scot-free, died an old man in his bed in 2011, I believe, of natural causes. So if there's such a thing as a miscarriage of justice, the Savile case is one of them. And so it is feasible and possible, and I'm not recommending this, of course, because I think Jimmy Savile was one of the worst scumbags in recent memory. But yeah, I'm just pointing out, while I again, just to be clear, so that we don't get into this normative entanglement, ethically speaking, I think what he did is terrible. I strongly condemn it. But meta-ethically speaking, I'm so happy that I've had this conversation with you, because it's already tidied up my use of the ethical versus meta-ethical language. Meta-ethically, I cannot say that there is a moral fact of the matter that he transgressed. Again, ethically, strongly condemn it. Meta-ethically, there's no moral fact of the matter. And Jimmy Savile lived exactly the kind of life that is the antithesis of the golden rule. He had everybody treat him well as a celebrity, but then he treated other people rotten and got away with it because of his power and his privilege. And there are lots of like medieval examples or dictator examples of people who did similar things where they were in so-called untouchable positions. But it's probably worth considering, to your point, Kane, that even in the case of kings, it can blow up in their face. How many kings have been dethroned because they tried to follow that rule? So as a matter of mere practicality, yeah, treating others how you want to be treated is probably the optimal way to proceed. But that does not make it a moral fact. It's just a practical utility.
Yes, I mean we just have to hope that you know, that just from a practical point of view, when people treat others like shit, it will blow up in their face. Unfortunately, that's obviously not the way the world always is.
No.
But you know, again, it's the point is when we're reasoning in that kind of way, I'm sort of reasoning about just, well, what would be best for me, right? I mean, if I don't care about other people, I just care about myself. I care about myself, so I ought to care about other people. Well, no, maybe it's just I care about myself, so I'm going to kind of get along with other people because I recognize that will, you know, make me better off in some way. That's all you need to say.
Yeah, that's a fair point. So yeah, I think we've addressed everything with that question. Yeah?
I think so.
So I'm going to jump ahead to question 13, if you wouldn't mind.
No problem.
Because I think this question is a fascinating one. It brings back up the color analogy, which I think is interesting. So this comes from Ayush, Ayush, Ayush. If I'm mispronouncing that, I apologize. And I quote: "Is color factual? Is an apple objectively red? When we say apple is red, what we mean to say is that the apple absorbs short wavelengths and reflects long ones from the sunlight within our visible spectrum. Keyword visible. What we are really describing here is a relationship between the object, apple, and our sensory organ, eye. But why use my eye as a reference? Why not a hummingbird's eye with a wider visible spectrum? Or a machine that can detect even more? What about colorblind people? These types of examples exist for the sense of hearing, smell, taste as well. So if our sense of morality isn't objective, then no information we receive from any of our sensory organs is objective. I wouldn't say that our sensory perception is as objective as laws of mathematics, but I think we can all agree that things like color and sound are objective in a limited sense of objectivity. It would be wrong to say that morality is purely subjective if it is a product of evolution, just like our other senses. So, what do you think, Kane?
Yeah, this is a good question.
I agree.
So this type of argument it's sometimes called a companions in guilt argument, right? So there's a sort of strategy that people on the realist side will use, where they will try to show that there are there are claims we make in other domains where those claims have the same sorts of features as moral claims. So, if you're an anti-realist about morality, then okay, you have to be an anti-realist about this stuff as well. So, for instance, color, right? It looks like there's a kind of analogy between claims we make about color and claims we make, and our moral judgments. So, if you're an anti-realist about morality, do you have to be an anti-realist about color? Now, I do want to just point out that actually, if you look at the philosophy and science of color, there's a pretty broad range of opinion about what color is. So there are some people who will say that color actually is just an objective feature of objects in the world. It's tricky to make that view work, but there are still some people defending it. The idea would be that there are certain natural kinds of surfaces that attract by our reactions, the reactions of our visual systems. On the other side, there are some people who say that color is just a complete illusion, and actually everything we say about color is just false. And then there are people in the middle who have this sort of view that, well, it's not, what's going on is it's like an interactive thing. So there are objects. Objects have particular properties, and then different properties of the surfaces of objects will make our visual systems react in particular ways. But obviously, somebody who is, red-green colorblind is going to react differently. A hummingbird is going to react differently again. Now, the thing is that when it comes to the debate between moral realists and moral anti-realists, I think that this sort of interactive view of color that you've expressed here is really very much on the anti-realist side. So consider, for instance, let's say I have two objects, and one is red and one is green. Okay, so I'm looking at these two objects, and I would say they're different colors. Then I show it to somebody who is red-green colorblind, and they'll say it's the same color, right? So we have two conflicting claims. I say these two objects are different colors. The person who is red-green colorblind says they're the same color. Now, if you take this sort of interactive view of colors, what you will say is, well, neither of you is right or wrong. I mean, when I say there are two different colors, I'm just expressing how it appears from my visual perspective. When they say there's one color, they're just expressing how it appears from their visual perspective. So it's not as though there's some fact of the matter that that one of us is mistaken about. But when it comes to moral claims, that is what the moral realist wants to say. So when I say, for instance, that abortion is permissible, and then I'm talking to somebody else and they say that abortion is wrong, the moral realist doesn't just want to say, well, there's this action in the world of abortion, and then from my point of view, I have like a positive reaction, whereas the other person has a negative reaction. What the moral realist wants to say is there's a fact of the matter about whether abortion is right or wrong. Like one of us is correct and the other one is mistaken. So yeah, I think that I'm kind of happy to kind of like go with this sort of color analogy, but I'm not sure that it really is going to do much to help the realist, given how you've elaborated the analogy, if that makes sense. That would be my initial response to that. Yeah.
Yeah. So in other words, the color analogy might actually blow up in their face here without realizing it.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's tricky because I'm not sure what exactly their position is. I mean, when they say, for instance, it would be wrong to say that morality is purely subjective if it's a product of evolution, just like our other senses. What do we mean by purely subjective? I mean, like when I say that, so as a moral anti-realist, I don't hold the view that morality is like there's just like nothing more to it than just like immediate preferences. Like obviously people can engage in moral reasoning and moral arguments. So I have values, I have sentiments, and then I can kind of locate inconsistencies in those values and resolve them. I can kind of present arguments to other people and try to persuade them. And in presenting an argument, that's obviously something that's going to be assessed by certain argumentative standards that are sort of assumed to be, that are assumed to be like independent of the moral domain. I mean, like I can, consistency, for instance, is a standard that applies everywhere, not just with respect to morality. So am I saying it's purely subjective? I mean, it's not like when I have a moral view, it's not like it's just something, it's not like, say, an after image where, that's just something that happens in my own mind. Obviously, I'm engaging with other people and presenting arguments and so on. So maybe you don't want to call that purely subjective. So I would just want to clarify what exactly their view is. But what I don't think is, I don't think we have a good case here for proposing that there are facts about what you ought or ought not to do that are independent of people's values, attitudes, and goals.
Yeah, my first thought here in response to this was to flip the table on them. So they seem to be trying to put the anti-realist in a position here where we have to accept certain conclusions that might not be intuitive to us, but because we're anti-realists about moral facts, maybe we'll have to be perhaps anti-realists about other things. But like, yeah, I mean, I don't know. It just, so they use the example. I'm just looking at the comment here again. They use the examples of sense, hearing, smell, and taste, which are all senses that we enjoy, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they seem to be inferring on that basis that morality is just this other sense that we have. So we actually have 6 senses, morality being the 6th one. And their evidence for this is that a lot like, taste and smell and hearing, we are receiving sense data, if you will. It's just that this sense data is of a psychological variety. We don't feel it on our tongue, or we don't feel it in our ear or in our nasal passage or what have you. We don't feel it on our skin as the sense of touch. We feel it as moral indignation or moral agreement or disagreement or what have you. But I would just remind this commenter that we have similar senses about a whole host of things that you wouldn't want to say are factual domains. Right? So again, I go back to my favorite example, the color example. This commenter might have a very strong feeling that putting 2 different colors together is improper. Oh, that doesn't look good. I'm getting a sense. And hearing is a sense, and Sound is hearing is a sense, and smell is a sense, and taste is a sense, and so now color is a sense, and improper colors is a sense. So therefore, color is a factual domain, is an objective domain, or something. I don't think that the commenter would want to accept that. Right? I'll give you another example: pineapple on pizza. Right? Some people have a very strong disapproving reaction to pineapple on pizza. Funnily enough, I don't feel one way or the other. I've never tasted it ever.
I think it's quite nice.
Fair enough. Well, you're going to receive indignation in the comments below. I guarantee it. Some people are going to be mortified and horrified. I'll give you an example, another one. I love milk. I love drinking milk, and I love it even more when there are ice cubes in it. I love ice cold milk. And people are horrified by this when I say it. They react with indignation in the same kind of way that they might react in relation to hearing about that old woman being mugged by a thief in the street and so on. They're horrified by it. They're disgusted by it and so on. Now, am I saying that the feeling is exactly the same? Of course not. That would be ridiculous. I'm just using this as a kind of a window into the pushback that I'm offering here, which is we have a sense that all sorts of things are improper or proper or right or wrong, even in areas which we would probably all agree are subjective. So the fact that we have moral senses and then equivocating on the word sense and linking it to our senses of sight and touch and taste, I do think there's an equivocation happening there. Because I would say that our senses are an objective domain. I'm comfortable with that claim, that your sense of smell is an objective thing and that your sense of hearing is an objective thing and so on. Not so sure about the color front. I'm undecided there, but suffice to say, I'm happy to concede that our sensorial systems are objective in a manner of speaking. But it doesn't follow that therefore every feeling we have is then rooted in something objective or rooted in objective facts in the case of morality, or objectively best colors in the case of colors, or objectively best foods in the case of pineapple on pizza. I don't know. What do you think about that? I'm trying to kind of create
I think
reductio ad absurdum here, if you will.
So one point, I mean, just to sort of, I mean, this is just a point of clarification, I think. When, you know, you were sort of saying about them being, you know, like our moral reactions, for instance, rooted in objective facts. I actually think that in some very obvious sense, they are rooted in what we would normally take to be the objective fact, which is,
sure.
You know, if I see somebody being enslaved, well, like, okay, I'd usually say, yeah, that's just a fact. That's something that's happening in the world,
yes,
regardless of whether or not I'm aware of it, right? But then what's happening is I'm having this reaction to it. Now, so the question is when I have this negative reaction, like, is that just sort of like I'm seeing this thing out there in the world and then I'm having this sentimental reaction to it? Or is it the case that I am detecting the fact that that is wrong? I'm detecting the wrongness of the thing. So, you know, do we say that like the wrongness is just a matter of, you know, what my values are, what my feelings are? Or do we say that I'm detecting the fact that it's wrong?
And this commenter appears to be implying that they are in fact detecting a moral fact that exists out there in the world, and they're using the sensorial capacities of a human being to make that claim. So just like your ear is actually detecting sound waves that are in the environment, your moral apparatus is detecting an immoral thing that's occurring in the environment. And I'm pushing back against that by pointing out that there are in fact a great number of things that we would all agree are subjective, and yet we have senses about them being right or wrong. Pineapple on pizza, glass of milk with ice. I'm just using food examples because they work. There are a whole lot of other examples we could use as well. Those are just simple examples to make the point. But that just because we have a sense that something is right or wrong, or just because we have a sense that we're approving or disapproving of something, doesn't mean that there is an objective stance, independent moral fact at play. That just doesn't follow.
So with the glass of milk, for instance, milk with ice, right? There's an objective fact about what's going on there. You know, we can scientifically describe the properties of the milk and the properties of ice and so on, and then how that interacts with the tongue and all of that. And then there's like something about you. There's There's something about the way that your brain works, which means that when you have them, when the milk goes on your tongue, it produces a positive reaction. And so we can kind of say like, oh well, from your perspective, this is good, right? This is a positive thing. I mean that kind of thing I think is not really enough for moral realists. Like we don't just
No.
A moral realist isn't going to just want to say, well, from somebody's perspective, this is good or this is bad. They'll want to say, it's like, no, from your perspective, yeah, from your perspective, maybe it's good, but no, objectively, it's bad. Your perspective is wrong. And like you say, I think that the mere fact that there are like patterns in how we respond to things, I don't think that establishes that. I would point out actually that this idea of there being a sort of a moral sense, but like maybe we can literally perceive the moral facts. This is actually, I think, an interesting point, which, I guess would be worth exploring more. If I were a realist, I would want to, because, I don't think I have a moral sense in that respect. Like to me, it's always seemed I've never had even the intuition that moral realism might be true. Like when I see things or read about things like slavery, the way that I react to it feels very much just like an emotion. It feels like something from within me. So I don't have the sense that I'm, detecting a fact out there. It's very, very different to color perception, because in the case of color perception, the way that it's presented is, it does seem as if these colors are like features of the surfaces of objects independent of me. And maybe that's wrong, right? Maybe ultimately, when we look at color science, it turns out that's not how color works. But I'm just saying that in terms of the phenomenology, the way that it feels to me perceptually, it's like, yeah, when I look at that blue cup, the blueness seems to be within the cup. Whereas when I, read about slavery, the wrongness, like that seems to be something that's happening within me. So I guess the point would be, it would be very interesting if the people who are defending this kind of moral sense or moral perception view could show that there's like some sort of pathology with my perceptual systems and the perceptual systems of other people like me. I mean, if you could show that, you might actually be able to start gaining, evidence for moral realism, right? If you could show that there's some way in which I'm cognitively deficient, then that might actually explain why I've been unable to detect these moral facts, and that would be a very interesting discovery.
It would be that would win the Nobel Prize, I would imagine. But yeah, that's basically why the color analogy blows up in the face of anybody who wants to use it, because so when you feel like the blueness is in the cup, it may in fact be the case that the blueness is merely a feature of your biology and how your eye interacts with the visual spectrum.
Mm-hmm.
The blueness isn't in the cup for another being who can see a wider visual spectrum or who interprets the world differently, might see that cup in a completely different light. The blueness might be in you as opposed to being out there in the world. And this is precisely my point. So unlike you, Kane, a lot of people have the intuition, and unlike me, a lot of people have the intuition that the wrongness is out there in the world. And I think that's what this questioner is driving at. So just like our ears are picking up on sound waves that are out there in the world, just like our noses are picking up on the scent that's out there in the world, in the particles of the air that we're smelling, a fresh meal being cooked, and, oh, I can smell it. The particles are out there in the world. A lot of people have the intuition that when they sense that something is wrong, the wrongness is out there in the world. But a lot like color, it could be the case, and in fact, I'm arguing that it is the case, and so are you, that the wrongness isn't actually out there in the world. The feeling of wrongness is just that. It's a feeling. It's not a property that you're apprehending in the environment, just like the blueness isn't a property that you're apprehending in the environment. So the last point I'll say on this question is this. One's feeling that they're apprehending something out there in the world is not a reliable pathway to the truth, because there are moments where we feel like we're apprehending something out there in the world and it turns out that we're not. Color might very well be an example of this. our feeling that something is being apprehended out there in the world can be correct. Like I feel like I'm hearing noises that are external to myself, and then it turns out that they are. But you can also be incorrect even there. Somebody suffering from tinnitus can hear white noise in their ear, but it's not coming from out there in the world. People with tinnitus, even when they block their ears, can still hear the sound because the audio isn't external to them. It's coming from inside. So even those examples can be challenged, right? The point
I mean,
is your feeling that there's wrongness out in the world isn't enough to conclude that there are stance independent moral facts that exist in the world. And that would be my 2 cents for what it's.
I think it's worth just noting that if you get on board with the sort of standard scientific framework, then what the world is like really like is something that departs very, very much from how it seems to be in perception. So, you know, I mean, there's no sense when I look at the table, for instance, I don't have the impression that this is mostly empty space.
Indeed.
And so, like, you know, I mean, so, I mean, I think we have to be quite cautious with these sorts of like arguments which appeal to, you know, our kind of ordinary perceptual data. Because, like, I mean, look, I don't know, I don't want to put words into Ayusha's mouth, but, you know, if you want to get on board with, again, the sort of standard scientific worldview, then you're definitely going to have to say that, well, maybe there's like some sense in which, yes, our perceptions are, you know, responsive to objective properties, but actually, like when you get like colors and you know, shapes and other perceptual data, it's really not at all clear in what sense that is, you know, revealing the facts. But you know, I mean, again, that's a big debate. It's slightly tangential, but yeah.
No, it's a good point. So I'm going to jump on then, Kane, to question 15 at this point.
Okay, no problem.
So this comes from Zachary, and Zachary writes, I think when it comes to objective versus subjective morality, I'm a fan of Matt Dillahunty's chess analogy. The game of chess is both subjective and objective. It's subjective in that we have to agree what the rules are, like what pieces can do what. It's objective in that after we have agreed, there are now objectively right and wrong moves to make that aren't subjected to opinion. I think the same is similarly true when it comes to morality. What do you think, Kane? Is the chess analogy a good one?
Well, I think we've kind of covered this.
I think we have.
In the previous discussion, we, you know, drew a distinction between categorical imperatives and hypothetical imperatives, where
Yes.
you know, a hypothetical imperative would have the form like, well, if you want X, then you ought to do Y, or as I would prefer to put it, if you want X, well, an effective means to getting X is to do Y. Now, when it comes to something like chess, look, we specify certain rules, and then once those rules are specified, we're able to say what counts as, you know, following or breaking those rules. So if I pick up a pawn and just move it right to the end of the board, okay, you can't do that. Breaks the rules of chess, and that's totally fine. And I think, you know, most moral anti-realists would probably be happy to get on board with the idea that that is just objective. Like, given the rules that you have specified, that particular move breaks those rules. The question is, what rules should we follow, right? So
Exactly.
So with the chess analogy, the question would be, what game should we be playing? Now,
Yes.
the moral realist will say there's a fact of the matter about what game you should be playing, and that's where the anti-realist says, like, what the hell is that? You know, what could make it what on earth could make it the case that, like, I just objectively ought to be playing chess?
Kane,
you know.
you're just being philosophically obtuse. What the hell, man?
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe we should be playing darts or pool or, you know. Yeah. So yeah, the chess analogy is a good analogy for explaining the hypothetical imperative, but it doesn't get us to a categorical imperative. It doesn't get us to a factual ought claim about what game we should be playing in the first place. And that's the key point, right?
Yeah.
Okie dokie. So moving on then to question 16. I like this question. This comes from Kevin West, who writes, if humans as a community tend to come to conclusions like torturing people or lying is bad, given time, doesn't it mean there might be some objective state of goodness to which we're striving, which can be called a moral fact? So this is the age-old moral progress. So given the fact that humanity appears to be progressing over time, doesn't that illustrate the existence of some moral fact of the matter? What say you, Kane?
So I guess the way I would put it slightly more carefully is to say that what we can see, arguably, is moral convergence.
Yes.
I don't know whether I would. I mean, I would call it progress. Obviously, given my standards and values, I'm glad that I live in the world today and not the world 300 years ago. But
Agreed.
The point is, look, there's this interesting phenomenon that we can see when we look at the development of humans over time, where it looks like, you know, we've started to converge on certain values. So we see, you know, if we look at like the scope of human history, I mean, there have been ups and downs when you look at, you know, more short-term periods, but like over the last few hundred years, you know, we see people converging on the idea of democracy, right? Like democracy is spread around the world. We see people converging on the idea of liberal values. We've seen things like, you know, the rights for women being extended, and you know, again, obviously we're far from perfect, but we can see a sort of trend, right? There's a trend.
Although to your earlier point, that convergence might not be near as wide as some people think it is.
Yes, I mean, this is obviously a danger, but I'm just going to grant, for the sake of argument, that there is indeed this convergence taking place.
I just wanted to clarify that in case anybody assumes that you're now contradicting yourself. Sorry, Kane.
Yeah, no. So I do think this is questionable, but just for the sake of argument, let's just grant that we see this convergence in values, and then, you know, that is it. That there is something puzzling about that. We now have to say, well, like, why did that happen? There's no obvious. It's not just obvious that that would happen. There's some reason why that's happened, and this could well be the basis of an argument for moral realism. Some people have said, well, the best explanation that we have for the convergence on values that we see is people are just detecting the moral facts, right? It's the same thing that would explain convergence on certain scientific claims. So we've similarly seen that there's a convergence on the view that the Earth orbits the sun rather than the Earth being the fixed center of the universe. What is it that explains that? Well, it's because, you know, we've like gone out and done experiments and, you know, reasoned, and the evidence has moved people in that direction. And so maybe that's what's going on in the moral case as well. And that kind of argument, I mean, you know, like, okay, I think that that's an argument that has to be taken seriously.
Indeed.
My view, however, is that there are better explanations. I think that we can account for convergence by appealing to things like just the fact that, you know, the world has become much more globalized. So, you know, communities are interacting with each other much more. And if you have, like, if you imagine like two separate communities and then, you know, they start interacting with each other, they might start off with very different values. It wouldn't be at all surprising if those communities then started to have similar values over time when they interact and more. I mean, so we've similarly seen a convergence, not just you know, not just on like the moral facts, but also on things like people's diets, also on things like the media that people consume,
clothing,
clothing, fashions, fads. So I would say it's. I don't. Let me put it this way. I don't think there are any features of moral convergence that are not straightforwardly explained by like just cultural interaction, by these sorts of cultural factors that would explain these other, you know, convergence on diets and clothing and so on. And so I just see no reason to postulate moral facts to account for that. So that's my response to that.
No, that's beautifully explained, Kane. Yeah, so there's convergence on clothing, and yet that doesn't demonstrate the existence of an objective moral standard vis-a-vis fashion, right? It's just that globalization is a thing. The world is much smaller today because of travel and because of global telecommunications technology. Everybody's got a global telecommunications device in their pocket. We call that a mobile phone, or you know, or a cell phone, or what have you. And so, yeah, we are sharing moral attitudes with one another, and these things rub off. But there's another thing that could explain moral convergence as well, and that is our shared evolutionary history, right? I mean, we are
Yeah.
all of the same species. And so it shouldn't surprise us that there are psychological proclivities that exist that are cross cultural and a tendency to move in a similar direction. So while we might have started off in very different places because of cultural circumstance or because of geopolitical circumstance, perhaps this moral convergence can be explained by a shared psychology and shared psychological patterns by virtue of the fact that we share an evolutionary history, right?
Yeah, I mean, so I think what's going on is that there's the sort of just general kind of facts about human psychology, as you say, as a result of evolutionary history, and then you have to bear in mind that because of things like globalization and the sort of spread of technology and so on, we are kind of homogenizing the environments in which people live. So I mean, of course, it's there are still differences, right? But like you say, I mean, everybody has the cell phone, everybody has access to the internet, and that is going to significantly shape people's values. So and given that we all have the same evolutionary heritage, it's maybe not surprising that when you put people with the same evolutionary heritage in the same sorts of environments, they end up developing the same sorts of values.
Yeah, indeed, indeed. And so that brings us to our final question of the night, Kane. I've had to skip a few just for the sake of time, but I love this final question. So let's see what you think. This comes from Carezalink. Carezalink? I'm going to go with that. Apologies, Carezalink, if I mispronounced that. And I quote, "Fact and truth are basically synonymous as they both refer to that which conforms to reality. If I take a ruler to my phone, I will find that it is a fact that it is 6 inches long. Except, to paraphrase Pratchett, you can put the universe through a sieve and not find a single inch anywhere. This suggests that things can be fact, truth, by virtue of accurately describing reality without needing to be real themselves. So as long as we have a measurable definition for morality, we can measure it just the same as we'd measure length or whatever else. To a far lower degree of accuracy for sure, but my phone is definitely not exactly 6 inches, so perfect precision is clearly not a requirement for being treated as fact. Take it away."
Yeah, I mean it's an interesting question.
It is.
I mean, I do wonder about some of the assumptions underlying it. It's not entirely obvious to me that we don't actually just find inches in the world. I mean, I'm not sure why I shouldn't say that so I can take my phone and I can say, well, is this like this bit of the phone like instantiates in the same way that the phone instantiates a color. Say I say that the phone is black, maybe I could say that instantiates like the length of 1 inch. I mean, certainly if somebody was to ask me for an example of something, like give me an example of something that's an inch, I could give it. Now I can't really give an inch that's sort of independent of anything that is an inch. But in the same way, I can't really give an example of something that's I don't know, a square but where like the squareness is not instantiated in any object. So I mean, I just don't know, right? But I guess I take the point, right? Which is what we have in the world are just various objects, and then we've come up. I mean, here's the way I would put this. We've come up with a certain scheme of measurement, which has various useful applications. And then within that scheme of measurement, we can state claims that we can evaluate as being true or false. So, we can say that this object is 3 inches long, and that might be true or false, and we can check that with a ruler. The question is how that can be translated to the case of objective moral facts. I mean, it's just not obvious to me what the analogy is trying to say. So if I try to think that, okay, so the objective moral fact is supposed to be something like an inch. Well, what? So we can't be saying that that this is something that we've just invented, because like we invent the inch as part of a system of measurement. If you were saying that we invent the moral fact somehow as part of a system of measurement, then I mean that would just sound like kind of anti-realism. If you're saying that the moral facts have been invented by us,
Yeah.
so you must be saying that. So you must be saying something else, but I'm just not sure. I'm a little bit
see if I
unclear.
can offer some edification here. So
Right? Yeah.
I think what this questioner is driving at is that measurements are objective, right? And yet you cannot find them in the world. And so if we're anti-realist just because nobody can show us a moral fact, well, then we're being inconsistent. I think that's the allegation, that anti-realists are being unfair to one extent or another, or they're behaving inconsistently, because on one hand they will agree that measurement is objective and it exists even though nobody can find an inch in the world. In and of itself, you can find an inch of something, an inch of string, an inch of cord or thread or whatever, but an inch is not instantiated in the world intrinsically in and of itself. And so we are being inconsistent by believing in measurements and that they are objective, and not believing in facts just because nobody can show us a moral fact. My response to this is to just bite the bullet. Measurements are social constructs. That's what they are. There is no factually existing inch, because an inch is a social construction. I mean, imperial measurements are called imperial measurements because the king literally decided this is how long a foot is, right? This is how long X, Y, and Z is, right? So, in my opinion, and look, I'm happy to be corrected on this, but measurements, what we decide how long an inch is just socially constructed. This is why in the US they use different measurement methods to what we use in Europe. We use the metric system, and they use the older system, the imperial system, or whatever you want to call it. So they'll measure distances on the road in miles, whereas in Europe, for the most part, with the exception of England, they measure things in kilometers and so on. These are social constructs. So to me, this question kind of blows up in the face of any moral realist who wants to use it in favor of the conclusion of moral realism, because I'm just happy to bite the bullet and say, yeah, measurements are social constructs, a lot like moral claims are. They're social constructs, which is why different societies have different moral preferences and attitudes about various things. Look at, I don't know, Saudi Arabia and how women are treated versus how women are treated in the UK. Those are different social constructs, different social norms are at play there. There is no stance independent moral fact of the matter as far as I can tell. And the same is true with measurement. Different measurement systems are used in different parts of the world, and they are just social constructs. So I think the questioner is trying to allege, Kane, that we are being inconsistent by believing that measurements are objective, or that a measurement system is objective, whereas moral facts aren't. They seem to be imagining that we are anti-realists because nobody has shown us a moral fact in the world, and yet we believe in measurements, yet nobody has shown us an inch in the world. Therefore, we're inconsistent. But actually, no, I'm just an anti-realist on both. So the question fails to establish any consistency, I'm afraid. I don't know. What do you think? Do you think that's what they're driving at, or have I missed the mark there?
I mean, possibly. I mean, I think certainly, if that's the sort of thing they're driving at, I'd probably have the same take as you. I would just say something like, yeah, I mean, if the claim is that, well, moral facts are objective in the same way that like our specification of what counts as an inch is objective, then I mean, the answer is just, well, you look, there are different systems of measurement. So that's going to, so if I can say like this is 6 inches within one system of measurement, and then in another system of measurement, I might say that it's, I don't know, 12 centimeters or something.
Or pushing that even further. Yeah. If we're going to say an inch is this long, the anti-realist can come along and say, well, why didn't we just decide to say an inch is this long instead? Right.
Yeah.
Why does an inch have to be this long? We in an alternate reality, in an alternate universe, if we were coming up with all of this again, those humans might have decided that an inch is actually twice as long as what we call an inch. That is the real point. Why ought I conclude that it is a fact that an inch must be this long. And there is no fact of the matter there. It is just socially constructed. At a certain point, somebody decided this is what we'll call an inch. And then that caught on in the social situation and spread and proliferated to the point now where we all recognize what an inch is. But it doesn't change the fact that it's a social construction. It's a very useful social construction.
Yeah.
But doesn't mean that there's an actual fact at bedrock there.
I think there's possibly another thing that this commenter might have in mind. So when they say they suggest things can be fact truth by virtue of accurately describing reality without needing to be real themselves. So, okay, so long as we have a measurable definition for morality, we can measure it in just the same way as we measure length or anything else. So maybe the idea is something more like this. That, okay, we can grant that, the inch is just something that we've stipulated, right? We've come up with whatever an inch is. Yes, there's no objective fact of the matter that an inch is this. That was something that was stipulated and decided. But given that we have stipulated a particular system of measurement, we can then say it is a fact that the phone is 6 inches long.
But now we're back to the hypothetical imperative again.
Well, I'm just trying to think about the role that because when I say something like, so if I say that slavery is bad, right, then the question is, how does that relate to the example of, or if I say that,
so they're using well-being. I'm assuming they're using well-being. So well, just like
maybe, but then you could use almost anything, right? Somebody who's like a complete egoist would not be interested in the well-being of others.
It comes down to a presupposition that a lot of people have about morality. I think the Sam Harrises of the world and so on have convinced large swathes of the population that morality is simply about well-being. It's about harm. And if you just grant that as your measuring stick, harm, well, then we can objectively render facts from that stipulation. So something is wrong insofar as it harms somebody against their will, against their preference. The reason I add against your will or against your preference is because people might want to be pedantic and say, oh, well, a tattoo harms somebody. Yeah, it does, but they want that. Harm just needs to be defined as unwanted pain, right? Or unwanted experiences, or however you want to word it. The problem here, of course, is that well-being is just not a very well-defined concept. There's a vagary that lurks there. But I think that's the measurements. I think that's where the questioner is seeing the analogy there. So just like I might use a tape measure, so long as we socially agree that an inch is what it is, then I can have a tape measure that I can use then to render objective claims about the length of objects in the world. And in the same manner, if I use well-being or the harm principle as my tape measure, well, then I can render objective claims in the world about why you ought not do this, because morality is about harm. I think perhaps that's what they're driving at, but it's messy.
I think in that case, yeah.
I don't think it works.
Yeah, in that case, the response that I would have would basically just be to make the point we made earlier about, okay, well, we can just grant that, of course, people have goals, and of course, there are means of achieving goals, and we can assess whether or not those means of achieving the goals are likely to be effective. But I don't think that you're going to get anything like objective moral facts out of that.
Yeah. And look, I could be entirely wrong with how I've interpreted this question. I just want to say that. I mean, I could be 100% wrong. Just one last thing I want to ask you, Kane, because I don't have another question, but just a curiosity for myself. What do you make of that thing where people say, oh, well, look, morality, they just define morality as being about well-being. And as soon as you grant that, well, then just objective oughts flow from that. If morality is about well-being, and we just say that definitionally, like ontologically, morality is simply about well-being, well, then it's clear that I ought not enslave somebody because that harms their well-being. It's clear that I ought not steal from somebody because that harms their well-being. What do you make of that? I would consider this almost like an ontological argument where they just define morality as being about well-being. And let's face it, every single moral system does just to steelman the proposition. If you ask a Kantian, why ought you not do X or whatever, they do tend to give you an answer that's couched to one extent or another in well-being. The universalizability principle, for example, invites the Kantian ethicist to imagine what it would be like if everybody in the world committed this action and how that could lead to your own undoing. So it does boil down to one extent or another to like well-being, right? The utilitarian is much easier to make this case for because they're literally thinking about pain and pleasure, which is arguably a feature of well-being, and so on. Even if you ask a divine command theorist, why ought I follow God's commands? Well, because I want to get to heaven and I don't want to go to hell, which is about your well-being. It seems like a lot of these ethical worldviews have at rock bottom a concern to one extent or another about well-being. So might there be a pathway to moral realism here if we only grant that morality is about well-being, which then makes it very easy to say that slavery is objectively wrong because it clearly and obviously harms somebody's well-being. What do you think?
I think I disagree with the characterization of Kantianism at least to some extent there, because the point of the universalizability principle is that there are going to be, as Kant sees it anyway, there are going to be sort of certain maxims where if you act on those maxims, it's actually just like logically contradictory to imagine a case where everybody is acting on that maxim. So it doesn't really have anything to do with well-being. It's just like it's just incoherent, right?
Okay, that makes sense. So I've misunderstood.
So there is a slight, but I mean, there's different tests that you can that the Kantian approach gives you, and well-being is relevant, to be clear. So, but with that said, I think that okay. So here's the way I would look at it. It seems to me that the vast majority of people are, to some extent, concerned with well-being. Now, first of all, there are lots of different theories of what well-being is. I mean, I don't think we can just sort of say like well-being and then actually just go ahead and be like, oh, well, now we can measure this, because we have to decide, well, when we talk about well-being, I mean, are we talking about just pleasure and pain? I mean, or are we talking about preferences and desires? Like, does it matter how many desires get satisfied? Because sometimes there might be a conflict, right? I mean, it might be the case that satisfying my desires actually fails to promote my pleasure. I might not be the best judge of what would produce pleasure for myself in the future. And some people aren't really very oriented towards getting pleasure anyway. So there's the conflict there. So yeah, there's lots of different theories of well-being. But I would just say, look, when it comes to metaethics, one of the questions that we have is, what exactly is the meaning of moral statements? And the sort of view that you're suggesting here is a kind of reductive naturalism, would be the technical term for this, where it's just saying, well, we can reduce moral concepts to these natural concepts. So we can say that, the concept of goodness just is the concept of well-being, and that's it. So, of course, there are objective facts about well-being, so there are objective facts about goodness. Now, I think that I think there are several problems with this, but one of the big ones is just this. There's a question about what exactly are you trying to do when you make this conceptual analysis? There's two options. The first option is you might claim that what you're trying to do is describe our actual moral concepts. So you're just trying to show, like, this is like an analysis of how people actually use the term good. And on that, if you're taking that line, then my answer would be, I think that your position is just empirically refuted by just the evidence about the variety of different ways that people use moral language. On the other hand, you might be suggesting this as a sort of alteration of our moral concepts. You might be saying, well, we should use moral concepts in this way. But if that's the claim, then it looks to me like you're basically just what's happening there is, well, you're now just entering into a kind of ethical debate, right? Really, what that question is just, well, what sort of moral framework should we adopt? And you know, at that point, again, you just run into this problem that it turns out that, well, people happen to have lots of different moral frameworks, and that's that. I suppose it's possible in principle to imagine that maybe in the future it could be the case that everybody ends up adopting the same moral framework. Maybe there is convergence on the same moral framework, and then maybe, you know, the language changes such that people do just use these moral terms to refer to you know, natural states in the world. And then I guess you would then be able to say that you're a realist about good and bad as those terms are used in that community. That's the best hope, I think, of this sort of view. But I don't think that. I think what would have happened is that there would have been a change in the concepts. I don't think that would. I mean, in other words, I think in that sort of hypothetical future community, it would just, people would just no longer be talking about moral realism versus moral anti-realism in the way that we're talking about it, and that might happen. But you know, we're not there yet, and obviously that's not how I'm talking. So I don't know if that answers the question.
You hinted there that people use moral language in different ways, which might actually betray the moral realists' goal there. What were you referring to exactly?
So okay, let me sort of be more specific about this. Let's say that we make the argument that so we're assuming that when I say the word good, that just means pleasure, and when I say that somebody, you know, ought to do something, that just means that it maximizes pleasure. That's it, right? And there's just nothing more to it. That's just what those statements mean. So now let's say that, you know, I go out and I find that actually there's a bunch of people who aren't utilitarians. Well, okay, what do I say about their language? So, you know, somebody who's, so let's say, for instance, in the case of the trolley problem, you know, where you have 5 people tied to one track, one person on another track. There's a trolley heading towards the 5 people. You can pull the lever and switch it to the other track. I'm going to say you ought to pull the lever. But then I talk to this other person who's a Kantian, and they say, no, you ought not to pull the lever.
Because being responsible for killing somebody is wrong in all cases, regardless of the consequences.
Now, if the claim is that when I say you ought to pull the lever, I'm just like, all that means, the meaning of that statement is that pulling the lever would maximize happiness. Well, the Kantian doesn't disagree with that. So that's clearly not what the Kantian is saying. It's just obviously not what they're claiming, because like we both agree that it would maximize happiness to do that, but the Kantian is still saying you ought not to do it. I think that a much more plausible account of moral statements is going to appeal to their sort of functional role in the following sense. When we say that something is good, what we are doing is we're saying, you know, we're sort of promoting it. We're saying, like, this is something that I want everybody to be doing. I'm going to negatively judge people who don't do that thing. I'm going to positively judge people who do that thing. You know, so it's sort of connected with these practices of like praise and blame, and, you know, promoting things and discouraging things. I think that that's more what the actual role of the word good is in our community. You know, it's not just a purely descriptive term where it's just saying something like, well, this maximizes pleasure. And if you think that the word good does just mean maximizes pleasure, then you end up with the rather strange result that like when you're talking to a Kantian or just any non-utilitarian, you end up saying that they're just not even making moral claims, and they're just talking about something completely different. But, you know, there's not really even any moral debate to be had about anything. So, you know, I just think that it's not a very compelling analysis of what the word means.
Yeah, that's beautifully explained, Kane. So in short, when somebody tries to pull the well-being card and say, well, look, morality is about well-being, all people who are talking about moral claims are talking about well-being, and so we can have objective claims about well-being. Well, the truth is not all people are talking about well-being. And so I must commend you for correcting me there. One of my goals with having conversations like this is to root out my own misconceptions. And clearly you've identified a misconception that I had in my mind about the universalizability principle when it comes to Kant.
to be clear, I think that well-being is a relevant consideration for most, and for certainly from a sort of Kantian point of view, it's relevant, it matters, but it's
Indeed.
not the whole thing.
Sure.
But just, I mean, it's worth noting, not for everybody. So, I mean, we're coming from a sort of very Western perspective. If you start looking at the sort of moral frameworks in like Buddhism and Taoism, I don't think that you get much emphasis on well-being at all. They don't really seem to care very much about that. So, I think that maybe Kantianism is not, Kantianism is sort of kind of a bit more mixed, right? They care about well-being a little bit, but like, if you read, like Taoist ethics, they explicitly will argue that, like, I mean, maybe this isn't so much about well-being, but they'll argue, for instance, that it's actually like a bad thing to try to pursue desires, right? Like, you just shouldn't try to satisfy your desires. There's just nothing good about that.
Yeah, well, Buddhism is the same. Greed, hatred, and delusion are considered to be the so-called three poisons. That hedonism is a kind of a poisonous, toxic force, and that to just chase your desires is a pathway to absolute misery. And more to the point, they're probably onto something there.
Maybe, yeah.
Kane, it's been an absolute pleasure, and we're coming up on the 3-hour mark. And I've loved every second of it. I must admit, every conversation with you is enlightening and entertaining in equal measure, and I can only hope that my audience have gotten something out of it. Specifically, the questioners, I hope they feel like their questions were dealt with thoroughly, honestly, and fairly, because that was certainly my goal. I know I was a bit frustrated with some of the questioners, but only because of their insinuations about being obtuse and that sort of thing. So I've tried my best to be fair, and you have been nothing short of amazing, Kane. So all I can say is I really appreciate you taking time out of your day to come and speak to a smaller channel like mine. And I'm sure my audience will appreciate it. And if you got to this point in the conversation, dear listener, please do jump into the comments below and extend some love Kane's direction. And while you're at it, jump into the description box and go visit Kane's channel and subscribe, because Kane's stuff is just absolutely incredible. I myself have learned an enormous amount, not only in this conversation, but from Kane in the past. And I continuously check in with Kane's channel because I'm always sure to take something away from it. And so, yeah, again, I probably sound like a broken record, but Kane, it really does mean the world to me. It's not just a platitude. It's incredibly humbling that you're willing to spend time with me here today. And I've really enjoyed the conversation, and I hope you have as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, thank you very much for all the kind words. I think this has been great. I really enjoyed it. So thanks for having me on the channel.
No, my pleasure, Kane. My pleasure. And as I said, dear listener, jump into the description box below there, and you'll find the link to Kane's channel. And I couldn't recommend that more highly. And until next time, bye-bye.